Belinda Audio presents this unabridged recording of Silver Wattle, written by Belinda Alexandra and read by Caroline Lee. The dedication reads, For Mauro. Chapter 1. We Czechs have a saying, do not let evil take you by surprise. I wish I had paid more attention to that warning. But then we also have a proverb, after the battle, everyone is a general. It is easy to see what one may have done differently in hindsight. When I remember Prague, I think of chestnut blossoms bursting out on the trees of Petřín Hill. I see shutters thrown open to blue skies and smell lilac wafting in on the breeze. I hear my sister Clara playing Chopin on the Petrov Grand in our house at the foot of the castle. My mother is there too, busy at her easel, blocking in the sky, roughing in a foreground, dabbing in the finer details of her latest painting. The book of verse falls from my lap while I listen to the music drift on the air as delicately as the lilac scent. Clara's fingers glide over the keyboard. From the time she first sat at the piano, my younger sister confounded music teachers by playing complex pieces with a subtleness that belied her age. She has a certain touch, a way of caressing the music that is best described as silky. My mother and I could listen to Clara play for hours on those mornings we spent together when my stepfather was away on business. And, being an indefatigable practicer, Clara readily obliged us. Even now, all these years later, when I think of her playing, a sense of peace washes over me. Later in the day, my mother, Clara, and I would eat potato soup and fruit dumplings while Mother read the newspaper to us. We were interested in developments in our newly born state, Czechoslovakia. It had come into existence with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the Great War, which had finished the previous year. But if Aunt Josephine arrived for a visit with her poodle, Fripp, the newspaper was put aside and the spirited spinster and her black-furred companion given our full attention. "Ah, look at you two girls," Aunt Josephine would say, addressing Clara and myself. "You grow more lovely each time I see you." Clara and I would exchange a smile. Aunt Josephine visited us 3 or 4 times a week and always said the same thing with an exclamation of surprise. "But what do you expect?" she asked when we reminded her of this fact. "With such a glorious mother." Although Mother had been friends with my father's sister for years, she was embarrassed by the compliment. Mother's round face was not classically beautiful, but her bowed smile and pink cheeks gave her a certain charm. She dressed superbly in shades of violet, and, although she was close to 40, there was not a strand of grey in her blonde hair or a wrinkle on her creamy skin. Some afternoons, Aunt Josephine arrived earlier than usual and in a state of excitement because she had received a letter from Uncle Ota. Mother would invite her into the drawing room with us, where we sat down on the gilded chairs like royal ladies on our thrones. Fripp would plonk himself at Aunt Josephine's feet. On one of these visits, Mother and the cook had made apple strudel that morning, and Mother's maid, Marie, was called to serve the pastry along with a pot of tea. When the strudel was presented to Aunt Josephine, she lifted her palm to her cheek in horror. "With my waist?" she cried, patting her belly, but accepted the plate Mother passed to her anyway. The smells of cinnamon and sultanas filled the air. The strudel was too tempting for anyone to resist. Silence reigned while we ate the strudel, although Aunt Josephine kept glancing at her purse, impatient to share the contents of the latest letter. Fripp, who was on a strict diet, lifted his nose in the air, but when he saw that none of the dessert was coming his way, he rested his head on his front paws and fell asleep. Said Clara, closing her eyes and relishing the strudel. "You must include this recipe in the box supper fundraiser," Aunt Josephine told Mother. At the start of each season, the women in our district baked their fanciest desserts and wrapped them in boxes covered with silk and decorated with ribbons, hearts, and flowers. The boxes were auctioned off to the highest bidders and the money given to the church to help the poor. Mother smiled and turned to me and Clara. I fell in love with your father that way. He always offered the most money for my Sunday babovka. It was a story that she had related to us 100 times, but we never tired of hearing it. I looked around the room. The house was every inch my mother, with its velvet curtains, tapestry cushions, and floral scrollwork, but the drawing room had touches of my father. The bronze stallion on the mantelpiece with its front hoof raised and its head thrown back, the acanthus leaf tea chest, the Turkish rug with its beasts of the forest motif. A man who has daughters has a family, and he who has sons has strangers, Father used to say whenever someone expressed their sympathy that he had no male heirs. It was an unusual sentiment for a man who had been a captain in the army, but it was true that Father had loved Clara and myself as dearly as he would have loved male children. For a moment, I saw us all together again at the country house in Doksi on Makovo Jezero. My father did not like to hunt and would take us riding through the woods in the early morning instead, so that we could observe the deer and the otters. I smelt the damp of the mossy earth mixed with the summer air as clearly as if I were there. "And where has your mind wandered to, Adelka?" Aunt Josephine asked. I woke from my daydream to see that everyone had finished their dessert and was looking at me. Clara hid her smile behind her napkin. At 9 years of age, Clara's features had already formed into the ones that would be with her all her life. The pointy chin and soft waves of golden brown hair growing upwards from her forehead created the shape of a heart. It was a shape true to her character because Clara was all heart, even under her sometimes cool exterior. "Adelka is a great one for dreaming," said Mother, smiling at me. "She has a writer's imagination." Aunt Josephine clapped her hands. "Ah, to be 16 again." I was expecting reminiscences about her youth, but instead she reached into her purse and pulled out the letter. "Your uncle has written to us again," she said, her eyes sparkling. "It is a most interesting letter." Clara and I leaned forward. Uncle Ota was Aunt Josephine's and my father's brother, and an adventurer who had avoided going into his father's sugar business by proposing he travel for education before settling down. Mother once explained it to me. "Your Uncle Ota started soberly enough with sojourns to Italy and France, but soon these trips extended to treks in Egypt and Palestine, from where he sent back pictures of himself in Arab dress and vivid descriptions of the temples of Karnak and Luxor. When his father called him home, Ota claimed that a fortune-teller had told him that if he ever stopped traveling, he would die." Clara and I had grown up unaware of Uncle Ota's whereabouts until he began corresponding with us through Aunt Josephine after Father was killed in the war. Yet his letters were so enthralling, it was as if we had known him all our lives. His salutation was always, "To my dear ladies," and although it was not clear if he intended the letters to be read by Mother as well as Aunt Josephine and ourselves, there seemed no harm in their being shared with everybody. My stepfather called Uncle Ota a povalec, a useless loafer, but we paid him no attention. Clara and I were captivated by our uncle's descriptions of his journeys up the Nile and the Ganges, and his visits to civilizations that had never heard of words like national revival and independent state. "To my dear ladies, I am sorry for my tardiness in writing, but I have been 3 weeks on the deck of a ship bound for Bombay, then a further week tied up with self-important customs officials." "India again," said Clara, tracing her finger along the map Aunt Josephine brought with her. "Perhaps he intends to travel overland to China this time." Aunt Josephine read Uncle Otter's letter with great expression, and Clara and I hung on every word about the devout of India who bathed in the holy rivers, and the medicine men who healed simply by opening their palms. The things I have seen here one could not imagine. A 5-legged cow wandering through the markets, a holy man making a pilgrimage on stilts, a ritual dance in which the worshippers throw coconuts into the air to crack them on their heads. Mother's reaction to the wonders Uncle Otter described was more reserved on these occasions. She nodded at every turn in the adventure, but all the while her face was blanched of colour, as if she had received a shock. I could not imagine what it was about Uncle Otter's letters that made Mother change so. The family photograph albums were full of pictures of my father and his older brother arm in arm, from their childhood until just after the time my father and Mother married. Mother had adored Father, who had in turn worshipped his brother. My father, according to Aunt Josephine, had been inconsolable when his own father disinherited Uncle Otter. "Do Uncle Otter's letters bother you?" I asked Mother when we were alone in the drawing room after Clara and Aunt Josephine had taken Fripp for a walk in the park. Her face did not change, but her eyes flashed with surprise. "No," she said, shaking her head. Her voice trailed off when she added, "Otter sounds very happy." When I remember Prague, I try not to think of my stepfather, Miloš. If I do, my stomach turns to knots and his voice booms in my head. "Marta, I want that useless maid sent away this afternoon." I see him in my memory, pale blonde like an ice prince, stamping about the house and admonishing my mother because Marie had overstarched his collar and he could not button it. "I don't know how your mother could have married him after Antonin." Pani Milotova, the Russian music teacher who gave Clara piano lessons, confided to me one day after my mother and stepfather had returned from their honeymoon. "He doesn't want Clara to play anything challenging, only decorative pieces. He broke a string on the piano just because I was teaching her Fauré's Le Voyageur." The question of why my mother would marry a man like my stepfather was on everyone's lips. "He's 7 years younger than you and has no position," Aunt Josephine had warned Mother the day their engagement was announced. "He is after your money." "My daughters need a father," Mother replied, "and he is cultured." Mother's stubbornness on the issue was legendary. Perhaps it was a kind of madness that came from the terrible grief she had suffered when the telegram arrived announcing Father's death in the first year of the war. It was to Aunt Josephine's credit that she remained Mother's friend after her second marriage, although our aunt would never visit us when my stepfather was in town. Mother and Miloš married in 1917. All I remember of the day is being annoyed that Miloš's mother said that because Miloš was fair like me, everyone would think I was his natural daughter. My father had been as dark as an Arab. Each time my stepfather, a partner in a firm of interior decorators and plasterers, returned from one of his business trips, our easy meals of soup and dumplings gave way to a table covered with a white cloth, candlesticks, and platters of roasted duck with sauerkraut, marinated beef, and saddles of oozing venison, which Clara refused to eat. "If you don't eat meat, Clara," my stepfather would say, pointing his finger at her, "not only will you fade away, but you will cease to be Czech." Why Mother had thought that Clara and I needed the kind of culture that Miloš was capable of teaching us escaped me. While he played the violin and danced more elegantly than any other man in Prague, one got the impression that he had never shaken the stigma of belonging to a trade. It was clear from my mother's pained expressions and silences 1 year into her new marriage that this truth had dawned on her. But there was nothing to be done now. Divorce was social suicide, and she had spent a fortune on buying Miloš his partnership in the firm. Clara was usually unmoved by our stepfather's admonitions against her vegetarianism, until his fierce blue eyes shifted to Mr. Rudolph, swimming in his tank on the sideboard. Milos had threatened to dump Clara's pet carp into the Vltava, where he would die of cold, and just his glance at the fish was sufficient to make Clara scoop a slice of beef onto her plate and nibble at it. Her face was always impassive, but I knew that her stomach was retching. Milos did not understand what it was about Mr. Rudolph that stopped Clara from eating meat or fish, but he sensed the connection and found it a useful threat. Czechs eat fish for Lent, and our farmers have been breeding fat, thick-boned carp for centuries. Carp and potato salad are the traditional Christmas dishes, and it was with the intention of buying a juicy fish for Christmas that Mother, Clara, and I set out, canvas bag in hand, one frosty December evening. It was the first time Clara had accompanied Mother and me to the Christmas markets. She reached out one hand to Mother and one to me and skipped along between us through the streets. When we reached the market, her eyes widened and she let go of us, running towards the brightly decorated huts. "Look, Maminka! Look, Adelka!" she cried, pointing to the rows of wooden toys and straw and paper ornaments. The Christmas lights danced in her eyes like tiny flames. After a sip of the hot spiced wine Mother bought from a vendor, Clara grabbed my hand and pulled me towards the nativity scene, where both of us patted the heads of the clay donkeys and sheep. Mother reminded us that we had to hurry because she had other things to prepare at home. The fishmongers were at the far end of the square. The cobblestones became slicker the closer we got to the stalls, and the air was especially chilly around the wooden vats where dozens of silvery carp swished together. Clara brought her face close to one, watching the fishes' mouths gaping for air. The enchantment on her face disappeared. "Adelka, they are drowning," she said. "How do you want it?" a fishmonger asked an old woman, dipping a net into the vat and scooping up a fish. "You'd be best to let it swim in the bathtub until Christmas Eve. It will be fresher that way." The woman pulled her shawl tighter around her head. "I don't have a bathtub. Kill it for me, please." Mother always brought our Christmas carp home to swim in the bath, as the fishmonger had suggested. I had never seen one killed. Somehow I had missed the connection between the live fish that came home with us and the fried one that appeared on a platter on Christmas Eve. The fishmonger dropped the writhing fish onto a pair of scales and from there to a wooden block. It stared up at the man with a bulging eye, as if begging for mercy. The fishmonger held the fish and lifted the mallet. Clara clenched my hand so tightly that her fingernails pierced both of our gloves. I tried to stretch my free hand over her eyes, but it was too late. The fishmonger slammed the mallet down. The bang sent a jar through me. He sliced off the fish's head and wrapped it with the body in a cloth, which he handed to the woman. After the woman left, my mother lifted her bag to the fishmonger. "Ours will be going in the bathtub for a few—" She stopped short when she saw that the fishmonger was looking beyond her, not listening. She turned and saw Clara backing away, gazing from myself to Mother with tear-filled eyes. Her mouth moved as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. She reminded me of the fish we had just seen killed, writhing and wriggling away from me each time I tried to grab her hand. "Clarinka, what's wrong?" my mother asked, rushing towards her but looking at me for an explanation. "The fish," I stuttered. She saw him kill the fish." Mr. Rudolph, the carp we brought home from the markets, swam in our bathtub for the next 3 nights. Mother had promised to keep him as a pet, secretly hoping Clara would turn her attention to something else. But Clara watched over the fish vigilantly, regarding anybody who went to the bathroom to wash their hands or sponge their face as a potential murderer. When we wanted to take a bath, we had to do it quickly because Mr. Rudolph needed to be moved to a bucket, and he would often flip himself out and onto the floor. Finally, in exasperation, my mother bought a tank for Mr. Rudolph and served another, less fortunate fish from the markets for Christmas dinner. But Clara was not fooled that the cooked fish had suffered less than the one she had seen killed at the markets. Mother and I realized then that Clara was seeing us differently, and that we would have to win back her trust. After that, my mother indulged Clara's whim to never touch meat or fish, and instead fed her nuts, dates, figs, grapes, raisins, and mushrooms as substitutes. As for Mr. Rudolph, carp were supposed to die a while after being removed from their pond, but he thrived in his tank. While our stepfather took exception to Clara's eating habits, he used our mealtimes to improve my education. The impromptu lessons made me so nervous I could not swallow my food. "Adela, what is it that allows a ship to stay afloat?" Miloš asked me one day. He always used my formal name, never the diminutive, Adelka, as the rest of my family did. I stared at the plate of beef soup and liver dumplings that were our meal that day, unable to think of the answer. He had explained it to me the previous summer when we were walking alongside the Vltava River. I knew it had something to do with the boat pushing water out of the way and some ancient Greek who had discovered the principle of displacement. But beyond that, I could not explain it exactly, and a precise answer was the only kind my stepfather would accept. Sweat gathered under the arches of my feet. Miloš closed his eyes and repeated his question so slowly that my face burned with shame. It was unfair of him to say that science was for men and then teach it to us in dribs and drabs. Clara still attended a school for young ladies 3 days a week, but Mother was mainly responsible for our education. She encouraged us to pursue our natural strengths. That was music for Clara and literature for me. I had read everything from the Czech poets to Chekhov's plays, and Uncle Otto's letters were an education in themselves. If my stepfather had asked me about the geography I had learned from Uncle Otto's travels, I could have answered him. But he was not interested in other countries and their cultures. "So you don't know? Then I suggest you look it up and give me an answer tomorrow," he sighed, before turning to Clara. "And you, young lady, what is the difference between a butterfly and a moth?" Clara thought for a moment before answering. "Moths fly by night and rest during the day. Butterflies love sunshine. A butterfly rests with its wings closed, but a moth sleeps with them spread open." Clara was in her element. She had an eye for the wonders of nature, the fall of light on a landscape, the rustle of wind through the trees. She loved to watch living creatures and could spend an afternoon studying an army of ants or an evening listening out for nightingales. But Miloš was interested in facts, not poetry. "Anything else?" he asked. "Moths are not as colorful as butterflies and have a fatter shape." Miloš gave a satisfied laugh and returned his attention to his food. I glanced at Mother. Her face was expressionless, but I saw the glint of tears in her eyes. Mother's hand on my shoulder stirred me from sleep later that night. "Adelka," she whispered. I struggled to open my eyes and focus on her standing next to the bed in her dressing gown and holding a lamp near her face. "What is it?" I asked, glancing at Clara, who was sleeping beside me. "Is anybody sick?" Mother put her finger to her lips and shook her head. She moved towards the door and then turned, indicating that I should follow her. The house was silent, except for the creaks of the floorboards under our feet and the occasional groan of its ancient walls. It had been in our family for nearly a century and had been left to Mother by her parents. My father had owned a family home too, where Aunt Josephine now lived, but had resided in Mother's house, for while it was not the grandest in Prague, it was one of the most beautiful. The exterior walls were pale blue, with white portals and dormers decorated with carved birds and flowers. The house resembled a jasperware vase, and its rear courtyard was a secret garden of ivy-covered fountains and benches. Once you had lived in the blue house on the corner of the square, you were spoiled to live anywhere else. I followed Mother down the hall and wondered if we would meet any of the family ghosts on our journey. There was great-grandfather Francis, who coughed before dashing from one room to another and then disappearing, and great-aunt Vera, who appeared whenever a change was made to the house. She either slammed doors in disapproval or left petals on the doorstep to demonstrate her pleasure. The ghost of Aunt Emily, who I saw every few years, was the most intriguing. Her face was young and tranquil, and there was no inkling in it that her life had ended tragically. One Christmas, I came across Emily when I thought I had heard Clara singing carols in the music room. I opened the door to find a woman by the piano. She vanished in an instant, but I recognized her as Emily from the picture in the locket Mother wore around her neck, which also contained a snippet of Father's hair. Mother, who was not able to see the ghosts, was happy when I told her that I had discovered her younger sister in the house. She was comforted that Emily seemed to have found the peace that had eluded her in life. We climbed the stairs that led to the attic. Mother opened the door and put the lamp on a table. "Here, sit," Mother told me, indicating a chair covered with a sheet. She switched on the attic light. The attic was crowded with furniture of generations past that could no longer fit in the main rooms. A beechwood armoire with brass-banded doors, cherrywood bed heads, a refectory table with lyre-shaped legs. A corner of the room was cordoned off, like a chamber in a museum. That place was devoted to my father's favourite pieces, for which Miloš had found no use in his rooms. They were arranged exactly as my father had positioned them in his study. I cast my eye over the walnut desk and matching bookcases, the gilt bronze inkstand, and the tall case clock with the hands stopped at 20 minutes past 11, the time we had received the telegram informing us of Father's death. Mother slipped a key from her pocket and opened a mahogany chest with a bear carved on it. I caught a glimpse of Father's sword, Bible, and officer's helmet. Mother lifted a black case from the chest and placed it on the desk. "I was going to give this to you when you came into your inheritance, but I can't see any reason to wait." She opened the case and produced a box brownie camera and passed it to me. I recognized it was the camera Father had bought before he left for Sarajevo. It was a simple design with a rotary shutter and a meniscus lens. My father had never been anything more than an amateur photographer. Yet I felt his spirit as soon as I touched it. I was taken back to those rides in the countryside around Doxy. I remembered the way Father regarded me with his gentle eyes when he helped me to mount my horse. I was sure that no other human being would ever love me as much. "Thank you," I said, looking up at Mother. One glance at the hopeful expression on her face, and I understood the meaning of the gift. She was trying to compensate me for having married a tyrant in place of the angel who had been my father. "Your mother is one of those women who can't not be married," Aunt Josephine told me the following day when I arrived at her house to show her the camera and to take pictures of her and Fripp. "She was lucky with my brother, but her second marriage, what a mistake." It was not the first time Aunt Josephine had lectured me on the subject of marriage. The women in my family did not always make good choices. "Men can be so charming before marriage, and so terrible afterwards," Aunt Josephine continued, positioning herself on the sofa with Fripp sitting beside her. My own father had an atrocious temper and used to order my poor mother around so much that I am certain it was he who sent her to an early grave. If Mother had known that Aunt Josephine lectured me against marriage, her hair would have turned white. For Mother, marriage was a woman's highest achievement. Not so with Aunt Josephine. Since the time I was old enough to visit her on my own, my aunt had plied me with articles from newspapers and magazines about women who had established themselves in occupations that had been previously forbidden to them. Women physicians, astronomers, chemists, journalists, and mountain climbers. "No, give me the free life," said Aunt Josephine, holding her straight nose in the air and lifting her chin as I depressed the shutter on the camera. "It might be simple, but it's mine." I walked the cobblestoned streets home and thought about Aunt Josephine. She lived more humbly than we did. Her house had been left to her by my father, but in order to keep it in good repair, she lived on one floor and rented out the others. She had one maid, a stern but loyal German woman called Hilda. Aunt Josephine was always in good temper, but the economies in her simple life were obvious. Daisies instead of roses in the vases, sponge cake instead of babufka, cotton instead of silk handkerchiefs. Could I be happy without the financial security a man gave? Then I thought about Mother and the drain Milosh was on her fortune as well as her happiness, and wondered if Aunt Josephine might be right. Before returning to the house, I walked around Petsin Hill. Mother could not have given me a better gift than the camera. I had always seen the world in images, but had been frustrated by my lack of ability to draw or paint. Suddenly, I had a means of expression. I took pictures of trees, of couples sitting on benches, of elegant dogs with their equally elegant mistresses. One Afghan hound stopped on the path in front of me and held his chin in the air. "I think he is posing," I told his mistress. "Do you mind if I take a photograph?" "There is no opportunity Prince would miss for some attention," she laughed. I loved dogs. As a child, I asked my parents every Christmas why we could not have one of our own. My mother's mouth would set in a firm line. "You know why," she always replied, turning away from me while my father attempted to distract my willful demands with promises of birds and goldfish. It was only when I was older that I was made to understand why my mother refused to own a dog. It was a front to save her family's reputation, for Aunt Emily was supposed to have died of madness brought on by a case of rabies after she was bitten by a stray dog. Because Mother knew many wealthy people and Milosh's clients were rich, we often attended parties in grand homes. One of these was the villa of Pani Provaznikova on one of the most exclusive avenues in the fashionable suburb of Bubanec. When Clara and I followed Mother and Milosh up the marble staircase, past rows of manservants and maids dressed in black, we knew we were in no ordinary house. French doors opened into a reception hall complete with Greek columns. For her first party of the season, Pani Provaznikova, the heiress to a coal fortune, had converted the hall into an indoor garden. Trellises of vines hung from the ceiling. A weeping willow drooped over an artificial pond with live ducks bobbing in it, and a path bordered by pots of golden azaleas led the way to Pani Provaznikova. The hostess sat on a floral throne surrounded by admirers perched on stools, while a string quartet played Haydn in the background. "There he is," she said, turning to welcome Milosh. "There is the genius who made all this happen." In her pink gown and dainty slippers, and with ostrich feathers in her hair, Pani Provaznikova was a fairy princess. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, but her face was young, and despite the frivolity of her outfit, her eyes had an intelligent gleam. "The house is a masterpiece," agreed one of Pani Provaznikova's companions. A woman sitting next to him squinted at us and produced such a tight-lipped smile that I cringed. "Marta, it is nice to see you," she said to Mother. "It has been a long time, and you brought your children." Mother introduced the woman as Pani Dobkova, a friend of hers from finishing school. "Such lovely girls," said Pani Dobkova, her eyes narrowing on us like a hawk. "One blonde, one dark." Clara flinched, and I wondered if Pani Dobkova's high-pitched voice was grating on her sensitive ears. In the house next to ours lived an old man who liked to whistle whenever he watered the flowers in his window box. But there was no tune to his serenade, which sounded about as musical as a squeaking wheel, and Clara would cup her ears and wince in pain whenever she heard him. Then I realized that she was staring at the glass eyes of the fox stole Pani Dobkova wore around her neck. The animal's feet hung limply at the woman's stodgy throat, its once wild claws manicured into tiny points. If Pani Dobkova noticed my sister's disgust, she did not show it. She patted Clara on the head and introduced her husband, who was named Vaclav Dobek. When he stood up to greet us, he stooped so badly he must have measured half his true size. "Why don't the children get something to eat?" suggested an old lady sitting near Pani Dobkova. She had the kindly eyes and apple cheeks of a storybook grandmother. That was the only kind of grandmother I knew, because my maternal one had died before I was born, and my only recollection of my paternal grandmother was the whiskers on her chin, which prickled me whenever she kissed me. I returned the woman's smile, not minding that she had referred to me as a child, although I was nearly 17. I took Clara's hand and led her to a table spread with cheeses, breads, apple pastries, chocolates, and marzipan sweets shaped into crowns. We returned with our plates to sit beside Mother. Milos was gone. I surveyed the room and found him talking to an elegant woman in a brocade dress. She glanced in our direction before turning away. Her gaze fell on us for only a second, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "She's pretty, isn't she?" whispered Pani Dobkova. "She is Pani Benyova, widow of the army officer, the late Major Benyo. Her family used to be one of the wealthiest in Prague, but her father gambled their fortune away. I've heard she is on the lookout for a better situation." "She is a talented pianist," added Pan Dobek. "Clara plays the piano beautifully," my mother said. "She is exceptional for her age." There was a sense of strain in her voice. It mirrored the anxiety creeping up on me that I could not explain. "Is that so?" asked the old lady, who was called Pani Kotska. "I do so love music and children, and these days have neither in my home. Perhaps, Pani Provaznikowa, you could introduce me to Pani Benyova, and I can ask her and Clara to play at a soirée for me one day." I turned to look again at Milos and Pani Benyova. The young one was beautiful, with raven black hair, a long neck, and a tiny pout for a mouth. She was like a swan. But it was my stepfather who most caught my attention. Gone was the stern look on his face. He lowered his eyes and whispered something that made Pani Benyova laugh. Then he laughed too, his eyes sparkling with gaiety. That must have been Mother's first impression of Milos, I thought. For I was convinced that she would not have chosen such a humorless man to be our stepfather had she known what he was really like. The invitation to attend Pani Kotska's soirée came a few weeks later. Clara was finishing up her lesson with Pani Milotova. They had been working on Beethoven's last keyboard work, the Six Bagatelles, Opus 126. It was a mature work for Clara to be studying, but she played it with deep feeling. I listened from the dining room where I was helping Marie lay out the table for lunch. Pani Milotova was a friend of my mother's, and she stayed to eat with us each Wednesday after Clara's lesson. When we were seated at the table, Mother handed her Pani Kotska's invitation. "Do you think it is too soon for Clara to perform for an audience?" she asked. "Will it take away her enjoyment of playing?" Pani Milotova, who Mother called Leader, but who we addressed formally because she was a teacher, studied the invitation. "Clarinka is a natural performer," she said. "She will shine even brighter with an audience." Mother turned away. Pani Milotova frowned, then a look of understanding crossed her face, and she blushed. "You could certainly use that as an excuse if you didn't wish to attend. But I would go if I were you. I would hold my head up and be proud of my daughter. You are the one who nurtured her talent." I looked from Mother to Pani Milotova. Some understanding had passed between them, but I was not sure what it meant. My stomach turned. I had the premonition that something was about to happen, but I had no idea what. Aunt Josephine appeared on our doorstep with Fripp soon after Pani Milotova had left. "I have a letter from Ota," she said, holding up a thick envelope. It was not opened, and when Aunt Josephine saw that I had noticed, she explained, "The moment I touched it, I knew it was something important, so I came straight here." Mother showed Aunt Josephine into the drawing room and gave Fripp a bowl of water. The maid brought tea as usual. The day was warm and the curtains were closed to keep out the heat. The drawing room was stuffy, and I was sure I felt the presence of a spirit somewhere near me, but had no idea to whom it belonged. While Aunt Josephine was always excited to receive a letter from Uncle Ota, she seemed more so than ever today. Her face was flushed, and she had not taken as much care as usual with her toilette. She smoothed down a lock of hair that had sprung loose from her chignon and pushed her hat straight before she commenced reading the letter. "To my dear ladies, so many extraordinary things have happened since I last wrote to you. Not the least is that I have married. Now, my dear ladies, I know that this is not something you are expecting to hear from me, and that you are wondering to what kind of woman I have decided to devote my life. Well, let me tell you that her name is Ranjana, which means delightful, and sums her up perfectly." "Ranjana? An Indian?" said Mother, patting her neck with a handkerchief. Clara and I leaned forward, eager to hear more. I had a picture of a marvelous princess bedecked in gold bangles and an ochre-colored sari. We were used to Uncle Ota's eccentricities and viewed his marriage as another of his adventures. We begged Aunt Josephine to continue to read the letter to us, and after a few minutes of disbelieving head-shaking, she obliged. "As you will recall from my last letter, I was heading towards Delhi from Bombay. I stopped in a village not far from Jaipur to visit a British officer and his family who I had met on a previous trip to the region. While I was there, the officer was informed that a young woman in a nearby village was intending to commit sati. You may have heard of this custom. A widow immolates herself on her husband's funeral pyre. Hindus believe that a woman who dies this way is virtuous and will go directly to heaven and redeem all her forefathers' sins in the process. The practice was outlawed by the British government last century and is condemned by enlightened Indian leaders. The officer asked if I would like to accompany him and some soldiers from his regiment. When we arrived in the village, we learned that the woman and her kindred had already left with the husband's body and were heading towards the cremation ground. We followed them there and viewed the party from the cover of some nearby hills. I have seen many temples dedicated to sati goddesses and have always sought not to interfere in anyone else's beliefs. The life of a widow in India is a hard one. On the death of her husband, she loses all status in the household, and her head is shaved. Her touch, her voice, and her appearance are considered abhorrent. But what we witnessed on the field below us was an abomination. The widow was no more than 21. She'd been tied to a horse and was being led along by a man in a red robe. Instead of her holding the symbols of Asati, a mirror and a lemon in each hand, they had been strung around her neck. Her head was lolling as if she had been drugged. Walking in front of her were a group of women singing and chanting. The officer told the soldiers with him to be ready for trouble because the girl was surrounded on all sides by youths carrying swords. They had got whiff of intervention and were ready to prevent it. We watched the party until they reached the spot where they intended to set the pyre alight. My stomach turned when the woman was dragged from the horse and thrown upon the platform alongside her husband's corpse. In her weakened state, she put up the fiercest struggle she could, but her pathetic cries for help were unheeded by the women, who simply chanted louder. The officer told me to stay some distance behind his men, then he commanded the soldiers down the hill between some rocks. I watched in horror as the youths covered the woman with sticks, then doused her with oil. But before they could light the pyre, the officer and his men were upon them. A fight ensued, in which several of the youths were shot, and one soldier had his arm wounded. While the men were having it out, I noticed one of the youths sneak away and light a torch. I ran down the hill and intercepted him before he reached the pyre. I had to deliver several blows to his stomach before I could force him to the ground and put the fire out. I pulled the sticks off the girl. Curiously, none of the women tried to stop me. When I reached the widow, I found her fitting and frothing at the mouth. I lifted my canteen to her lips, convinced that she had been poisoned and was done for anyway. But after a few moments, the convulsions ceased, and she looked up at me with the richest coffee-colored eyes I have ever seen. The rest I leave to your imagination, only to tell you that after that fatal meeting of eyes, we travelled to Calcutta, and from there to Ceylon, where we were married yesterday amongst bougainvillea, hibiscus, and gardenias, in what must have been the original Garden of Eden. My dear ladies, I am sure that this letter has you astonished, but I hope that you will share with me in my own happy bewilderment. I am a man who does not change his habits easily. Therefore, while my decision may have been quick, do not think it was unconsidered. Ranjana is an unusual young woman. She was betrothed at 10 years of age to her husband, who was then 60. Although the marriage was arranged, he was a wealthy businessman who did not want an ignorant wife. Ranjana often accompanied him on his trips to Jaipur, where he traded with the British Raj, and she was educated by governesses in English, French, and German. She assures me that her husband would never have agreed to her committing sati, and that the whole idea was dreamed up by her in-laws because her husband had made provision for her in his will, a practice unheard of in India. She is quite a linguist, and her Czech is coming along nicely. Much better than my attempts at Marwari and Hindi, which leave her in fits of laughter. Anyway, with Ranjana, a widow, and me a Czech, we cannot stay in this region for long, and must find a new place soon. We are thinking of going to the 5th continent, Australia. "Well, I say," said Aunt Josephine, "he is full of surprises." I was startled to hear a sob. Clara, Aunt Josephine, and I turned and saw that Mother had risen from her chair and was standing by the fireplace. "Good gracious, what is it?" said Aunt Josephine, rushing to Mother's side. Clara and I both stood, not sure of what to do. I thought of calling Marie to bring Mother a glass of water, but I stopped myself. This was a sight she should not see. "I'm fine," said Mother, wiping at her wet cheeks. But she was anything but fine. She was trembling, and there was a desolate look in her eyes. Aunt Josephine led her back to the sofa and sat down with her. Clara poured Mother another cup of tea. Mother had made a scene, and she would have to give us an explanation for it. "I'm so sorry," she said, dabbing at her tears with her handkerchief. "You see, I knew Otto when he was young, and he said that he would never marry. His news came as a shock because it took me back to the days when I first met your father. That was 20 years ago. It is a jolt when things change suddenly and you realize that you are no longer young, that so much has already passed and you can never go back and live those days again." Aunt Josephine patted Mother's hand sympathetically, but her mouth twitched, and she did not seem convinced by Mother's explanation. I thought back to Miloš unashamedly flirting with Pani Benyova at Pani Provaznikova's party, and the mysterious conversation between Mother and Pani Milotova earlier in the day. Could these be the true reasons for Mother's reaction? I was even more puzzled that night when I passed Mother's room and heard her weeping. Not gentle tears of sentimentality, but choking sobs of unbridled grief. I was tempted to knock on her door and try to comfort her, but something told me not to disturb her, to let her anguish run its course. When I climbed into bed beside the already sleeping Clara, I found it difficult to drift into dreams. It seemed to me that Mother was grieving as bitterly over Uncle Otto's marriage as she had over Father's death. Chapter 2. Mother accepted the invitation to Pani Kutska's musical evening, and Clara and Pani Milotova worked on some pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin. They chose 6 sonatas and preludes, rather than longer pieces, so that Clara could adapt what to play based on the mood of the gathering. When the evening came around, I was amazed at how at ease Clara was about the prospect of playing for her first audience. She hummed her repertoire while she went about bathing and dressing, as if she did not have a care in the world. Pani Milotova had been right in describing Clara as a natural performer. Mother had bestowed upon Clara and me beautiful porcelain dolls when we were growing up, but our favourites were the ones we made ourselves by painting faces on wooden spoons. We gave our divas coiffures made from wool and costumed them in pieces of lace and tulle. We created mini puppet shows together to showcase the dolls. Clara composed the songs, while I penned the dialogue and storyline. But when the time came to perform for Mother and her friends, my tongue always managed to lodge itself in my throat, and Clara would be left to carry the extravaganza on her own. My only consolation was that afterwards Mother would praise the story. "You may not be a performer, but you created some wonderful scenarios." She was always quick to comfort me. The evening of the soirée, Miloš, who had been in Brno for business, arrived home just after 7. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, glaring at his watch and yelling at us to hurry. My heart sank. Miloš was always impatient with us, but that night was especially so. I hurried down the stairs, tripping on the rug in my haste to avoid his wrath. But Clara remained unruffled. She glided down the staircase with the grace of a princess. "You had better not act so proudly at the party, young lady," Miloš muttered, "or it will be your last." Mother emerged from the drawing room looking splendid in a lilac dress with silver beads over the bodice and hem. The scent of lily of the valley, her favourite perfume, wafted around her. She glanced at Miloš, and I wondered if she had heard him, but she said nothing and turned to Clara and myself. Her face broke into a smile. "You will be the most beautiful girls in the room." Mother always lavished praise on us, but from the way Miloš skulked to the car, I wondered if the comment had been made with a more pointed purpose on this occasion. Pani Kotska's apartment was everything a grandmother's home should be, down to the Tiffany lamps, tulip-patterned wallpaper, and upholstered chairs. The piano was in the drawing room, and when we arrived there were already guests drinking tea and eating honey cake. Pani Benyova, in a claret gown with an overdress of iridescent sequins, was talking to a man with white hair and peaked eyebrows. I recognized him as Leos Janáček, the composer of Jen Jufar. I had heard he was in Prague that month to attend a concert. Pani Kotska had barely a chance to greet us before Pani Benyova left the esteemed guest's side and minced over to us. "I am charmed to meet you," she said to Mother. "Milos did a wonderful job of my house, and I have been dying to meet the woman who inspires him." Mother grimaced at the compliment. The young widow was even more striking up close, with fine skin and sapphire eyes. But there was something insincere about her, like people who say they like opera when they do not. And the way she had rushed in without waiting for an introduction was vulgar. I was surprised that Milos welcomed her so warmly, being quick to correct bad manners in myself and Clara, and was even more surprised when he kissed Pani Benyova on the hand. Pan Dobek, who was sitting with his wife near the fireplace, called out to Milos and engaged him in conversation about the design he wanted for a new hotel. While my stepfather's attention was taken, Pani Benyova leaned towards Clara. "I cannot wait to hear you play," she said, placing her hand on Clara's shoulder. "Would you like to be first or second?" Clara lifted her chin. "I would like to play second, thank you." Pani Benyova's eyes narrowed. She glanced at me. Although the way she held her torso and head straight made her appear controlled, annoyance flashed in her eyes. It was rude of Clara to have taken the second place, as that was usually reserved for the better pianist, which Pani Benyova assumed herself to be. I glanced at Mother, but she simply pursed her lips and rubbed her bracelet. Normally she would have scolded Clara for impertinence, but it appeared she did not intend to say anything, and I decided that I would not either. Pani Kotska's only comment was that she was going to serve another round of tea. Pani Benyova glanced around for our stepfather. It would be out of place to make a scene, so I guessed she intended to tell him discreetly to switch the order. But Milos was involved in his conversation with Pan Dobek. I could see that Pani Benyova was weighing up in her mind whether she should discuss the issue with Pani Kotska, but before she could say anything, the old lady began a long story about her love of music. "It all started for me when I was a girl, and my family attended a performance of Bach's Brandenburg concertos. They were sublime, everything so beautifully balanced and in proportion, every note so right. Well, if she wanted to play second, Pani Benyova should not have asked Clara what she wanted to do, I told myself. She should have left it to Pani Kotska, who would have placed the most senior pianist last anyway. Pani Kotska called for the gathering to take their places in the chairs around the piano. The black gloss of the instrument and the glow from the lamps gave Pani Benyova's skin a luminescent sheen when she sat down at the keyboard. Pani Kotska announced that her lovely guest was going to play 2 pieces, starting with Beethoven's Appassionata. The piece was well known as technically challenging, and Pani Benyova wasted no time in maneuvering from the quietly menacing opening into the tempestuous chordal passages. The sound was explosive in the small room, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Although the speed with which Pani Benyova approached the piece was questionable, she did not smear the arpeggios. There was no doubt that she was good. Professor Janacek nodded to Milos, whose face glowed with such pride one could easily have thought that Pani Benyova was his daughter, not Clara. Mother's expression told a different story. She was on the verge of tears, having found the first moment when people were not looking at her to let her emotions show. I thought about Pani Benyova's comment that she wanted to meet the woman who inspired Milos. My stepfather would not have said that. He never bestowed praise on anyone else that he could accept for himself. The unsettling feelings about Pani Benyova I had first experienced at Pani Proveznikova's party returned to me. I squeezed Mother's hand and stared at the set of Milos's shoulders and the way his lips were pursed in boyish pleasure. I was barely a woman and not well versed in the ways of the world, but I began to guess why Miloš had become colder towards Mother and even more impatient with us. But if Pani Benjova was seeking a better position, she would not find it with Miloš. He had no fortune of his own. For her final selection, Pani Benjova played Valet Doberman from Liszt's Years of Pilgrimage. It was an emotionally charged piece with blazing block chords and double octaves that she played at impressive speed, although she sometimes blurred the drama of the piece. But no one could argue that she lacked technique or could not bring off sweeping gestures with ease. When Pani Benjova lifted her hands from the keys, there was a hush, then applause, Miloš clapping loudest of all. I remembered his lectures on tempering your applause to the size of the room, and his hypocrisy made me despise him more. Pani Benjova stood up, her chest heaving. I glanced at Clara, expecting her to be intimidated, but she wore the same calm expression that she had since the beginning of the evening. After more cake and tea were served, and everyone was seated again, Pani Kotska introduced Clara and announced that she would play Mozart's Fantasia in D minor, Chopin's Prelude in D flat, and Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I heard Miloš and Pani Benjova snigger. Not only was Clara's repertoire shorter, but compared to what Pani Benjova had attempted, the pieces were standard fare. Clara sat at the keyboard. The gathering giggled when she stood up again to readjust the stool so that her feet were comfortably on the floor. My face burned. It was bad enough that my mother was being humiliated, but I could not stand people laughing at my sister. Unlike Pani Benjova, who had constantly smiled and tossed her head, Clara simply set her hands over the keys, paused, then began playing. The condescending smiles vanished, and wonder came to the faces of the listeners. Clara's fingers fluttered over the keys. Her nimble touch gave the introduction of the Fantasia a shimmering quality. The music was not complicated, but Clara played so elegantly and with such poetry that it was hard to believe we were listening to a young girl. The piece was carefully shaped, and Clara's handwork so neat it was mesmerizing. She made every note count. Those qualities were the result of her dedicated practice, but the way she found something fresh in the passages was uniquely her own. The audience did not murmur or fidget when she began Chopin's Prelude in D flat. The piece was referred to as the raindrop because of the repeated A flat or G sharp notes, and was thought to have been composed when Chopin, who was in Majorca for the good weather, was kept in his house for days because of rain. It was one of the first recital tunes children learned to play, and could be heard any time of the day flowing out the open windows of Mala Strana, but somehow Clara managed to breathe new life into it. She played the light and dark sections with such emotion it unsettled me. Pani Milotova said that the piano, more than any other instrument, gave away the personality of the player. I saw aspects to Clara I had never witnessed before. The girl at the keyboard was still frightened there might be monsters under her bed, but in music she was a force of nature, causing the audience to tremble with emotion. It was the same with her Moonlight Sonata. The piece was lyrical, vivid, tragic and haunting, all at the same time. I glanced at Pani Benjova. Her smug expression had faded. Clara was not using effect as an end, but was making the music live. When she finished, the audience was unable to react until Pani Kotska stood up and led the applause. She requested one more piece from Clara, and I understood why. Clara had taken us to a place where it was too beautiful to stay. We could not exist there. She had to bring us back to the world with its brutality and trivialness. Did Clara understand this? I didn't know, but she politely obliged with a lively mazurka. The tension between Mother and Miloš escalated the moment Clara stepped away from the piano and Professor Janacek rushed towards us, and not Pani Benjova. What a magnificent child! What a talent! Surely you will send her to the conservatorium, he exclaimed. Mother's face lit up, but her joy at the compliment was quickly quashed by Miloš. He puffed out his chest. "There is no future for a female pianist beyond the drawing room," he said. Professor Janacek stepped back. "On the contrary," he said, "there is always a future when the talent is so exceptional." Miloš glanced over to Pani Beňová, who, although talking to Pani Dobková in a gay manner, looked peeved. She had proved herself accomplished, but Clara had outshone her. Miloš realized that and turned back to Professor Janacek. "Pianists propagate like rabbits, my honored professor," he said. "Those who cannot make careers as soloists become teachers, and so produce more pianists. The cycle begins again." Mother, who would never contradict a man or make a scene in public, held her tongue until we were in the car. There she could not contain herself any longer. "Does Pani Beňová restrict her talents to the drawing room?" she asked, rage constricting her vocal cords. It was painful to see her this way because she was not an angry person by nature. "Be quiet," Miloš said. "I am only saying what everyone else is thinking. Do you call yourself discreet? You'll bring shame on all of us fawning over a woman with a reputation." "A reputation as what?" asked Miloš. Mother shook her head. "A marriage mercenary. Everyone can see it. No decent man will have her." Miloš did not respond. We drove home in silence. As soon as we were inside the front door, he ordered Clara and me to bed. While Clara slept, exhausted from the excitement and attention as only a 9-year-old could be, I listened to the muffled voices of Mother and Miloš arguing in the parlor. When the clock by my bed struck 2, I could bear it no longer. I crept down the stairs. When I approached the parlor doors, the words became clearer. "Never forget that I made you what you are," Mother told Miloš, "and that this house and my fortune will go to Adela and Clara." Miloš's answer was faint, but I heard him leave the room by the other door. A few minutes later, a car started up in the street and sped away. My mother had done nothing wrong. She had merely reminded Miloš that her daughters came first. But her words had been spoken in a rage, and if she'd had the chance to think things through, she may not have voiced those sentiments so definitely. The strain between Miloš and Mother was conspicuous throughout the following week. We ate dismal meals together, Miloš sitting with a furrowed brow, Mother barely saying anything. When they did speak to each other, it was usually with an undertone of criticism. "Where are you going?" Mother asked Miloš one afternoon as he hovered near the front door, pulling on his coat and checking his appearance in the hall mirror. "Where did you put my riding gloves?" Miloš asked in return. He had indirectly answered the question and at the same time implied that Mother's orderliness caused him great inconvenience. Clara, who had not seen the storm coming and was too young to understand Pani Beňová's role in it, thought that the antagonism between Mother and Miloš was because of her performance at the soirée. She played peacemaker, embracing Mother at every opportunity to comfort her, while trying at the same time to placate Miloš. One day, Miloš decided to criticize one of the younger maids by pointing out every finger mark on the walls, and Clara followed behind him with a sponge, ready to remove the stains he found. "It's not your fault," I told her. "I wanted to protect my sister from the hurts of the world. It was a mission Mother bestowed on me when she revealed the truth about her younger sister." "Emily was gentle and kind, and a talented musician," Mother said, showing me the necklace she had kept as a memento, a gold chain from which a filigree medallion with a centre of blue crystal dangled. "But she was susceptible to slights. I was her older sister, but I did not watch her closely enough. When she was 19, an infatuation with a scoundrel sent her spiraling downwards. Emilie started hearing voices. My father called the best doctors, and she was confined to bed. But she thought her fingers were talking to her, and cut them off. She was committed to an asylum, but she died that winter of pneumonia. I shivered. So the story about the rabid dog had been to hide Emilie's insanity. The truth about my aunt's death pained me. After I am gone, you must protect Clara and keep her safe, Mother instructed me. When I look at her delicate face, I see Emilie all over again. Do not lose sight of Clara the way I lost sight of my sister. But how does a sister, even a loving, devoted one, protect her charge from the facts of life? One morning I found Mr. Rudolph floating upside down in his tank. As nothing in his diet or conditions had changed, I assumed his death was due to natural causes. I had no idea how to break the news to Clara. I considered buying another fish, but Clara was almost impossible to fool, and it would be difficult to find a carp even half the size of Mr. Rudolph, so far from Christmas. I resigned myself to introducing her to a sad reality of life. He didn't suffer, I assured Clara when she stood before the tank, and you gave him a longer, happier life than he otherwise would have had. Clara lifted her chin stoically, but tears pooled in her eyes and slid down her cheeks. I pressed her close to me. It's acceptable to cry, I said. Goodbye is the saddest word in the dictionary. Clara and I wrapped Mr. Rudolph's body, which had taken on an opaque sheen, in muslin. We then walked along the winding streets and past the baroque houses of Mala Strana to the woods of Petzin Hill. I dug a hole in a spot where the light filtered through the avenue of maple trees, while Clara collected stones and blossoms to place on the grave. "Face him towards the path," she said when it came time to lay Mr. Rudolph in the ground, "so he can see the people walk by. He liked to watch us when we passed by him on the way to the parlour." I took a photograph of Clara standing by the grave, and afterwards we strolled around the park and on to Hradčany. It was a warm day with a gentle breeze, and the least I could do was to give Clara pleasant memories of Mr. Rudolph's burial. When Mother's friend Anyusha died in childbirth several years earlier, I was plagued for weeks by nightmares of the funeral. The sickly smell of incense and coffin wood and the stern face of the priest had confused me with their morbidity. My image of Anyusha while she was alive was of her bright smile and the sound of her raucous laughter. Clara and I walked the cobblestoned streets of the castle district, stopping occasionally for me to photograph the medieval house signs. We tried to guess what they represented. Before houses were numbered, tradesmen and merchants used these emblems instead of an address. There were shoes for cobblers, crowns for nobles, violins for music makers, and keys for locksmiths. We had enjoyed walking here ever since I was old enough to take Clara on my own, and we always seemed to discover new signs in the endless nooks and alleys. Clara was patient with my picture-taking. I waited until the clouds in the background were right, or the sunlight was in a good position, before taking my shot. But when her pace slowed, I understood she was tired. I bought some cherries and we ate them on our way home. At the base of the castle, we stopped to look over the panoramic view of Prague. It seemed reposeful, with the Vltava flowing under the Charles Bridge, and the dome of St. Nicholas, and the Gothic tower of the town hall rising up through the red roofs. Prague was my home, and the vista from the castle was as much a part of me as my hands and feet. I took Clara's fingers, sticky with cherry juice, and clutched them in my own. I re-avowed silently that I would guard her well-being with my life. My birthday that year marked the end of summer and the beginning of autumn. The day before had been sunny and warm, but on the morning of the 21st of August I looked out my window to see that fog had settled over the city. I washed my face and hands in the basin and hurried downstairs to have breakfast with Mother and Clara. In the dining room the maids were laying out bread rolls and assorted jams. There was also a vanilla cake with pink icing. I was surprised to see Milos sitting at the table reading the paper. Things had settled down between him and Mother to a cold courtesy, but I did not know if it was because Milos had given up on Pani Benyova or whether Mother had chosen to turn a blind eye to his indiscretions in order to keep the peace. Wyświetno niedzielski k narodzeniom. Clara wished me happy birthday and pulled out the seat next to her. Clara and Josephine helped me choose your present this year, said Mother, passing me something soft wrapped in tissue paper with a purple bow. I opened the gift to find a shell-pink silk scarf, almost as large as a shawl, with a fringed hem and peach blossoms embroidered in each corner. It's lovely, I said, pressing the fabric to my cheek. You are a young lady now, said Mother with a proud smile. You should only wear beautiful things. Aunt Josephine avoided our house when Milos was in town, so she invited the three of us to her home for afternoon tea that day instead. Has Uncle Ota not written to you at all these past months, Aunt Josephine? Clara asked when we sat down in the parlour. While our drawing room was all French windows and Delftware porcelain, Aunt Josephine's parlour was more comfortable. The wall panels were a rich mahogany, and crimson drapes with gold tassels framed the ceiling-to-floor windows. Aunt Josephine glanced at my mother. I have, in fact, just received a letter, she said, but we have all been so busy that I didn't have the chance to tell you about it. Clara's eyes flew open with delight, but I knew that Aunt Josephine, usually so scrupulously honest, was not telling the truth. The first thing she did whenever she received a letter from Uncle Ota was rush to us to read it. Please go ahead, said Mother, folding her hands in her lap. Ota's letters give the girls such pleasure. Aunt Josephine shifted in her seat. Perhaps she was nervous that Mother would start crying again. But she was put at ease when Mother remarked that she enjoyed Uncle Ota's letters because his adventures far surpass any excitement we know in Prague, despite the concerts and galleries. Very well, she said, rising from her chair and leaving the room. She returned with a crumpled envelope and sat down. Fripp rested his chin on her shoe. Aunt Josephine unfolded the letter and commenced to read. To my dear ladies, after a voyage of seasickness and storms, Ranjana and I are now in Australia. It is the most mystifying country I have ever seen. Its beauty is both lush and dry. Its people, the same. We are presently in Perth, on the west coast, and were greeted in the city not by people, but by dozens of black and white birds called magpies, sitting on the docks and fences. Ranjana has fallen in love with the plant and bird life and has taken up botanizing. It is wonderful to watch her pressing the specimens of flowers and seeds into her album. Even with her sari and dark skin, she is more attentive than any European lady I have seen. We will sail on to Sydney in a few days' time, where I will try to find work, as the passage here swallowed most of my funds. Ranjana and I have decided that if Sydney is to our liking, we will stay. Intellectuals are not valued in this harsh land, so I may need to work with my hands. I once said that I would never stop travelling, but I have decided that if I choose to live in a foreign country, one so different from my native homeland, it does not count. There is a raw sense of adventure and possibility about this country that makes me think it is the place for us to live. Not that it was easy to be accepted past the boarding offices. That, my dear nieces, was a feat greater than passing examinations at the University of Prague. Not so much for me, as the colour of my skin is more acceptable than Ranjana's. Australians would like to keep anyone from Asia, and most non-English-speaking Europeans, out of their country, and would succeed too if not for British objections to the insult it would be to their subjects in India. Because Australian officials cannot legally discriminate against anyone who is not suffering an infectious disease, is not a criminal or a menace to society in some way, they have come up with a dictation test. Being given a test in English, the national language, I can understand. But the test may be administered in any prescribed language. A Maltese applicant was given a test in Dutch, a Spaniard a test in German, and a German fluent in several languages was eventually failed when he was tested in Gaelic. The poor man was sentenced to 6 months' jail for being an illegal immigrant. You can see what Ranjana was up against. Luckily, she passed the test in English and French and was finally let through when they could not find anyone to test her in Russian. We will send you more news and an address when we get to Sydney. Meanwhile, Ranjana has asked me to enclose a book about the birds of Australia. We believe little Clara is particularly interested in these things. Yours lovingly, Ota and Ranjana. Mother's reaction to Uncle Ota's letter was the opposite of how she had responded to the previous one. Ranjana sounds delightful, she said, and very suited to Ota. She poured out the tea while Aunt Josephine cut the kolach. I hope we may meet them one day, I said. Mother sat down again. You would like Ota very much. I remember his keen mind and his quick wit. But it doesn't sound as if he intends to return to Prague any time soon. Aunt Josephine placed a slice of kolach in front of Clara, who adored the dough bread sweet. But she was absorbed in the book on birds Ranjana had sent for her, and even the scent of the cheese, stewed prune and apricot filling did not stir her. Soon she was telling us that the brightly coloured rainbow lorikeets had brush-like appendages on their tongues for eating nectar, that willy wagtails sang when the moon was bright, and that galahs mated for life. We were never ones for travel, were we, Marta? Asked Aunt Josephine, studying Mother's face. Oh, we had our seasons in Florence and Paris, but that was enough for us. We learned the languages so we could pronounce the foods we served at dinner parties, but we never found anywhere that made us as happy as home. Mother blushed, but held her own under Aunt Josephine's gaze. That's right, she answered. That's why I waited for Antonin to finish his training before I married him. I was lonely without him, but I would have been useless away from my mother and home. Aunt Josephine searched Mother's face once more before sitting back. I want to change these drapes, she said, clutching the velvet curtains. They are too heavy. Maybe you could suggest something, Marta. You have good taste. I sensed that Aunt Josephine had been trying to find out something, but became afraid of going too far. Mother and Aunt Josephine were as different as apples and oranges, but they had been friends for 20 years. They would have died for each other, if it ever came to that. I was as confused about Mother's behaviour as Aunt Josephine. I wondered if Mother had been in love with Uncle Ota once. But anyone who had seen my mother and father together could not have doubted their bond. Mother's face had lit up whenever Father entered the room, and nothing could distract her attention when he was speaking. As for my father, witnesses said it was Mother's name on his lips when he died. I picked up Uncle Ota's letter and read it for myself, trying to discover the man behind the swirling handwriting. In the pictures I had seen of him, Uncle Ota was the opposite of my father, tall, with a shock of hair and keen, light-coloured eyes. But no matter how many times I read the letter or stared at the lines, I could not solve the puzzle. Not long after, another letter arrived from Uncle Ota. To my dear ladies, Ranjana and I are in Sydney now. And what a city! We loved it the moment we set eyes on it. The magnificent buildings of golden sandstone took our breath away. We know their names now: St. Mary's Cathedral, the Lands Office Tower, the Town Hall, and the Queen Victoria Building. True, one sees Europe in their classical and Renaissance styles, but there is also something different, something other about the place. Perhaps it is the natural setting, the opal blue harbour with its coves and beaches, the ochre villas set amongst the silvery green bushland. And the trees! Our first purchase in the city was a botany book, and my lovely wife has already recorded descriptions and the botanic names of the fascinating species. These are some of the gum trees that thrill us with their gigantic trunks and branches that reach out like the arms of a Hindu goddess, embracing all manner of bird life. Sydney red gum, Angophora costata. Red bloodwood, Eucalyptus gummifera. Scribbly gums, Eucalyptus racemosa and Eucalyptus hemistoma. Sydney peppermint, Eucalyptus piperita. The birds make a deafening chatter in them in the mornings and evenings. White parrots with massive beaks and claws, and smaller ones that are coloured like tropical fruit. Your mother would certainly have inspiration enough for 1,000 of her paintings if she were to see all this beauty. We have rented a house on part of the harbour known as Watson's Bay. It is a ramshackle dwelling that is falling to bits around us, but it is the best we can do for now. Although Ranjana swapped her sari for Western dress and speaks more refined English than most of the resident population, our joy is tainted by the prejudice against her. When we approached landlords about places they had advertised, they were nearly all friendly to me, but changed tune as soon as they saw Ranjana. There was one man who was leasing what amounted to a tin shack in a yard full of coils of wire and blocks of discarded wood, who almost came to blows with me simply because I made him an offer. This behaviour is inconsistent with Australians in general, who are mostly egalitarian and carefree. Perhaps it is the location, so far from the British Isles, from where nearly all of them come, that makes them so afraid of Orientals. The only people who welcomed us were the artists of King's Cross, but I did not fancy making Ranjana live in a rat-infested hovel. So, after some frantic searching, we found this place. We are renting it from an elderly blind woman and her daughter. The end of it all is that for the first time in years, I have a permanent address, which will make it easier for you to write to me. I look forward to hearing the news about you and your lovely mother, although I notice that my sister does not mention your stepfather much. How is he these days? Still up to his ears in chandeliers and chinoiserie motif fabrics? Our love always, Ota and Ranjana. From his wording, it was finally clear that Uncle Ota had meant his letters for Clara and me. He had never mentioned Mother and Milos directly before. I wondered what Mother would say about the matter. For the past few months she had been lethargic and withdrawn. Even her paintings had been lacklustre in recent times, variations on the view from our window. But this recent letter seemed to have a positive effect on her. The following morning she was up at dawn, sketching the birds from the book Ranjana had sent. Later in the day, Mother donned a dress of violet crepe de chine and asked Pani Milotova to keep us company while she ran some errands. She returned in the afternoon with truffled chocolates and a set of watercolours. The next morning she was at the dining table, surrounded by paper, paints and water jars, working on a picture of a superb fairy wren. Clara sat beside her, reading out the habits of the bird, in quite good English considering that Mother had only recently started giving her lessons. Male superb fairy wrens have blue and black plumage above and on the throat. The birds give a series of high-pitched trills, which the male extends into a full song. They are often found in urban parks and gardens, in eastern Australia. My mother acted like someone who had carried a burden that had suddenly been lifted. It was as if she had been given a second chance at life. A few nights after Clara's 10th birthday in September, Mother suffered acute stomach pains. The family physician, Dr. Socek, was called. "Now, what ails your dear mother that you should disturb an old man's rest?" was the first thing Dr. Socek said in his raspy voice when he arrived on our doorstep. His manners were surly, but his hands were gentle. He had no son to take his place, and the pauses in his speech and the twist in his spine put him well beyond retirement. But he was the only doctor Mother trusted, having brought not only Clara and myself into the world, but her as well. "He may act like a stable hand, but he cures like the hand of God," she said. After examining Mother, Dr. Socek spoke with Milos and me in the drawing room. "I cannot find a physical cause for the pains," he said, casting his eye over Milos. "It would seem to me that they are due to anxiety and a lack of exercise." "Whenever they can't find a physical cause, they put it down to nerves," Milos said to me after Dr. Socek had left. If Mother was feeling anxious, I had no doubt who was the cause of it. But Milos surprised me. The weather had turned bitterly cold and Mother could not walk outside. So every morning and afternoon he would link arms with her to stroll around the house. "I feel like a tourist in my own domain," Mother laughed. Milos laughed too. I would never like him, let alone love him as much as I had loved my father. But I was glad things had improved between them. By Christmas, Mother was feeling better, and Milos remained attentive. He also taught Clara to play chess, and me how to dance the Viennese waltz without becoming dizzy. "Don't trust him," Aunt Josephine warned me when I went to visit her on New Year's Day. "He's just worked out which side of the bread is buttered and has decided to be more pleasant. Pani Benyeva couldn't keep him in the same style as your mother does, and he knows it. You and Clara will inherit your mother's house and fortune. We may not yet have the vote in this new republic, but we are still mistresses of our property, married or not." I turned away. I never liked to talk about inheritances or wills. I could not imagine life without Mother. I wanted her to live forever. Aunt Josephine, in her efforts to introduce me to the world of independent women, arranged for us to take typing lessons in the spring together. It was a strange exercise, as neither of us needed to work, but Aunt Josephine was fascinated by women who were ambitious to improve their place in the world through means other than marriage. So once a week, under the pretense of sewing together, Aunt Josephine and I travelled over the Charles Bridge to the medieval streets of Stare Mesto, where we joined the typing class at the back of a leather goods store. While Clara produced beautiful music under the guidance of Pani Milotova, Aunt Josephine and I sat in a cramped room with the ambitious daughters of shopkeepers and postmistresses and learned to touch type. I was amused by my aunt, who, having lived the privileged existence of an upper-class lady, was so enamoured of women who worked for their living. I enjoyed the lessons and the chatter of the girls before class, even though our instructress, Pani Sudkova, was a tyrant. At first, her cold stare made me so nervous that when she looked over my shoulder, my fingers slipped and I ended up with a jam of keys all trying to print at the same time. "You must train your fingers to press and lift independently," she said, raising her thick eyebrows and slapping my wrist with a ruler. "And strike the keys harder." Nonetheless, once I sped up to 20 words a minute, I found myself looking forward to the classes. There was something about the rhythmic clack of keys striking the platens and the ding of the bells when the students reached the end of a line that was hypnotic. It was not long before I progressed from drills to typing letters. Summer that year was more pleasant than the previous one had been. There was no sign of Pani Benyova, although Aunt Josephine was adamant that Miloš was only being more discreet. Mother, however, was much happier. Her stomach pains disappeared and she and Miloš attended summer balls and parties together. Aunt Josephine and I graduated from secretarial school, and Clara excelled in her lessons with Pani Milotova. But by the end of summer, Mother's pains returned more severely than before. She was bedridden for days at a time. Then, the unthinkable happened. I was on my way home from Aunt Josephine's when I turned the corner to the square and saw Clara sitting on the front steps of our house. She was leaning with her head against the stone balustrade. "Clara!" I cried, running up to her. "Mother will have a fit if she sees you sitting out here like an urchin." Clara lifted her face, and the terror in her eyes sent me reeling backwards. "Mother," she said, pointing to the second-floor window. The curtains were drawn. A sickening feeling rose in my stomach. "What's happened?" I asked, my chest constricted so tightly I could barely get the words out. Clara trembled. "Mother collapsed soon after you left. Miloš said Dr. Socek was hopeless and called another doctor to see her. Dr. Hoffman examined Mother and said her appendix is on the verge of bursting. He didn't want to risk taking her to the hospital. He is operating on her now. There is a nurse with him, and Pani Milotova is helping too." The ground shifted beneath my feet. The pinks, yellows, and greens of the houses of the square melted together. When I had left, Mother was sitting in the morning room writing letters. I was running late, so I blew her a kiss before heading towards the door. She called me back, and when I peered into the room, she smiled and said, "I love you." I grasped Clara's hand. "Come inside," I said. The eerie quiet of the house was a contrast to the hammering of my heart. Pani Milotova rushed out of the kitchen carrying a saucepan of boiled water. She wore a white kitchen apron that was smeared with blood. I nearly fainted. "Pray for your mother," she said, before running up the stairs. I guided Clara to the parlor and sank to my knees. Clara threw herself down beside me. My head was swimming too much to pray, but Clara closed her eyes and pleaded with God for Mother's life, offering up everything dear to her if he would save her. She even promised to give up music if that was the sacrifice God wanted. Half an hour later, Miloš trudged down the stairs. His shoulders were slumped and his eyes were bloodshot. Without his arrogant air, he was almost unrecognizable. "Your mother is gravely ill," he told us, just as the priest arrived. "The doctor will try to save her." He led the priest upstairs, but did not ask us to follow. Clara and I clung to the sliver of hope that Mother would survive the operation as fervently as we clung to each other while we awaited further news. There was a knock at the door, and Marie hurried to answer it. I cried out when I saw Aunt Josephine standing in the hall. "Marie sent for me," she said, throwing her arms around us. "Has anyone made you supper?" "I can't eat," wept Clara. "I'm not hungry, Aunt Josephine," I said. Aunt Josephine embraced us again. Her face was ashen, and the lines around her mouth seemed to have deepened since I saw her only a few hours ago. She was distressed. But instead of obeying an impulse to rush upstairs and find out what was happening, she did exactly what Mother would have asked her to do. She took care of us. After making us drink some tea and eat 2 shortbread biscuits each for strength, Aunt Josephine returned us to the parlor. "Let's pray," she said. My mind calmed in her presence. Aunt Josephine's prayer was a more peaceful appeal than the desperate petitions Clara and I had made. She shunned the church as hypocritical and followed her own path. "I'm spiritual, but I am not religious," she always said. Now she thanked God for the beautiful person my mother was and prayed he would watch over her and her daughters. It occurred to me that she spoke to God as one does a friend, although her voice broke on the Amen. A short while later, the doctor came down the stairs. He was nothing like doddery old Dr. Socek, who usually attended Mother. He was younger, with black hair and long sideburns. Aunt Josephine was surprised not to see Dr. Socek, and I quickly explained why Miloš had chosen someone new. "The girls had better come up now," Dr. Hoffman said. The smells of iodine and blood pervaded the air of Mother's bedroom. The priest had finished administering the last rites, and the expression of pity on his face made me buckle at the knees. A nurse stood in the corner washing and wiping instruments. Pani Milotova hovered beside her, weeping. When she saw us, she reached out her arms. "They opened her up, but it was too late," she whimpered. "They could do nothing but sew her up again." In the dim light, I saw Mother lying on her bed with a sheet pulled up to her neck. She was so pale she looked like a marble statue on a church crypt. "Mother?" I sobbed, moving towards her. I was not sure if she heard me, but then she murmured, "Adelka, come here." I pressed my cheek to hers. It was cold. "Chest," she whispered to me. "Look in the chest." Mother turned to Aunt Josephine and tried to say something to her, but lost her strength. She was fading before our eyes. The doctor sat down on the bed next to Mother and listened to her chest. "Her heartbeat is faint," he said. "She is close to death." Mother's eyes closed as if she had fallen asleep. Suddenly they opened. "Emily," she said, "look, Emily is here. She is as beautiful as ever." Mother gasped for air, but as quickly as the spasm started, it finished. Her eyes glazed over, and the breath rushed out of her in what seemed like a long sigh. My legs shook, and I pressed my palms against my forehead, trying to stop myself from fainting. "What's happened?" Clara cried. Aunt Josephine sank into a chair and buried her head in her hands. I returned my attention to Mother's face, desperately searching for a sign of life. Dr. Hoffman pressed his fingers to Mother's throat, feeling for a pulse. He found nothing and closed her eyes. Then the surreal became the real, and the walls pressed in on me. The doctor gave Miloš some instructions, and the priest began a prayer, but their voices sounded distant and hollow. The nurse stepped forward, made the sign of the cross, and folded Mother's arms across her chest. I felt the veil of separation slip between us and Mother. The person on whose bosom I had drawn my first breath had breathed her last. I turned to Clara, who was trembling from head to foot. I wanted to throw my arms around her, to comfort her and have her comfort me. But I was frozen to the spot. Chapter 3. Mother was laid out in a dress of shimmering indigo. The windows were draped in black curtains, and the Delftware porcelain replaced with candles in silver holders. The exterior of our house was still blue with white trimmings, but inside it was as gloomy as night. Miloš, Aunt Josephine, Pani Milotova, Clara, and I, all dressed in mourning attire, took turns sitting with Mother, who lay in her rosewood coffin for 3 days before the funeral. I stared at her impassive face, not able to believe that her eyes would not open at any moment and that she would come to life again. Despite my grief, I held to my promise to watch over Clara, who had reacted to Mother's death with stunned silence. She had barely said a word since the terrible event. On the second night after Mother's death, when Aunt Josephine and Pani Milotova watched over her coffin, Clara and I lay in bed together, listening to a storm brewing. Drops of water slid down the window panes. I ran my fingers through Clara's river of hair. "Mother is with Father now," she whispered. I wrapped my arm around her. Her skin smelt sweet, like vanilla cream, and I thought of the cake Mother had intended to make for the following day, which was Clara's birthday. Lightning flashed and I saw Clara's tear-filled eyes. I was thankful that she was handling Mother's death so courageously. "When our mourning period is over, we will celebrate your birthday," I promised her. Early in the morning, I was awoken by screams and the sound of glass breaking. Marie rushed into the room. "Selechna Rudzikova," she cried, addressing me formally. "Your sister!" I leaped out of bed so quickly that the room turned white and I had to grip onto the wall. I ran after Marie down the stairs to the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. Clara was standing barefoot on the black and white tiles, surrounded by broken glass. Her nightdress and hands were stained red. I imagined Mother discovering Emily in the sewing room after she had cut off her fingers, but then I realized that the stains had clumps of seeds in them. They were not blood, but raspberry jam. Across the benches and floor were strewn the smashed jars of jam Clara had made with Mother the previous month. Clara snatched another jar from the shelf and raised her arm, intending to throw it to the floor. "Don't," I pleaded. I had not had time to put on slippers, and I stepped gingerly towards her through the broken glass. She stared at me, her mouth twisted into a muted cry of rage. Tears filled her eyes, and she began to sob. "Why?" she cried. "Why?" Her voice had such a beseeching tone that it snapped my heart. I reached her without cutting myself and threw my arms around her. Her thin frame trembled in my grasp. "I don't know," I said, burying my face in her neck. "I don't know." Even more disturbing than Clara's violent outpouring of grief was the arrival of Dr. Socek the day after Mother's funeral. Marie had no idea what to make of his request to see Mother, so she asked him to wait in the drawing room and called me. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, rising from his chair, still wheezing from having run up the stairs to our front door. "I was away, visiting my daughter." "We buried Mother yesterday," I told him, bewildered by his presence. I asked Marie to call Aunt Josephine, who was still staying with us. I could not understand why Dr. Socek had come. He had misdiagnosed Mother's appendicitis as anxiety pains. If he had recognized the true cause of her discomfort, she would have gone to hospital in plenty of time, and she would be sitting in the room with us now. Dr. Socek's face fell, and he lowered himself into the chair again. "No chance of an autopsy, then," he said. His words hit me with such force that I was on the verge of being sick. Of course there would be no autopsy on Mother. We knew why she died. Dr. Socek rushed towards Aunt Josephine when she entered the room. "Pani Valentova was a robust woman," he said, using Mother's maiden name. "She should have outlived all of us. What sort of infection was she supposed to have died of?" Aunt Josephine glanced at me. I had managed to compose myself enough that morning to start some sewing, and now Dr. Socek had arrived and was saying terrible things. The tears I had tried to hold back flowed down my cheeks. Aunt Josephine drew herself up as if preparing for battle. "She died of appendicitis, Dr. Socek. When the doctor operated, he saw that the infection had spread to her other organs. There was nothing he could do." Aunt Josephine said the words matter-of-factly, but the undertone of blame was there. Dr. Socek studied her with his rheumy eyes. "You had better get her exhumed," he said quietly. I reeled back in horror at the suggestion. Mother, exhumed after we had just buried her in holy ground. "Let the dead have their peace," I said, my voice rising in agitation. Dr. Socek, said Aunt Josephine, you are not making any sense, and you are upsetting my niece, who has already had a terrible shock. Milosh passed the drawing room and saw Dr. Socek with us. He frowned. What brings you here? Dr. Socek's lips pinched together as if he had nothing to say to Milosh. If you do not have anything to offer us, Dr. Socek, I think you had better leave, Milosh said, his lip curling the same way Fripp's did when he saw a menacing dog. Dr. Socek glanced from me to Aunt Josephine. There was a tremble in his hands, and I felt sorry for him. He had been good to our family over the years. I was not angry at him for misdiagnosing Mother, only sad. She had thought so highly of him. She had been a breech birth, and as a younger man, he had saved her and her mother. But this time round, he had been negligent. Dr. Socek turned to me as though he wanted to say something else, but another hostile glance from Milosh made him think better of it. He picked up his coat and hat. I will be going, he said. I accompanied him to the hall and helped him with his coat. Goodbye, Dr. Socek, I said, opening the door. He looked over his shoulder to check we were alone, then grabbed my arm. You dressed her for the funeral, didn't you? He asked. You saw the scars. The pity I felt for him turned to revulsion again. I remembered the stitched scar that had twisted across Mother's belly like a braided roll. I tried to push Dr. Socek away, but he gripped me more firmly. I thought he must have gone mad. Did you see the scar under it? The fine, white one? I'll call my stepfather, I warned him, looking back into the house. Dr. Socek loosened his grip, and I stumbled. He rushed down the front stairs and raised his arm to hail a cab. One arrived, and he was about to step into it when he turned around. Appendicitis, he snorted. Find out what really happened, will you? I removed your mother's appendix myself when she was 18 years old. It took minutes before Aunt Josephine could bring herself to speak after I reported what Dr. Socek had said. The news knocked the wind out of her, as it had from me. She leaned on the table where Mother's coffin had rested and shook her head. We must be careful not to jump to conclusions, she said. Dr. Socek is old, and even your mother said he was sometimes forgetful. Perhaps he is confused. Perhaps it was Emily's appendix that he removed. I don't recall your mother ever mentioning it, and that would have been not long before I met her. I sat back, overtaken by another wave of nausea. I wondered, with all that had happened in the last few days, if I would ever feel the vitality of my age again. But what if Dr. Socek was right? What did that mean? Dr. Hoffman's face floated up before me. He had been professional in his manner and did not appear to be someone who would misdiagnose an illness and then try to cover it up. I told Aunt Josephine what I was thinking. No, I don't understand what it means either, she said. We must speak to Pani Milotova. After all, she was there. We were surprised to find Pani Milotova wearing her morning dress when we arrived at her apartment. Only immediate members of the family were expected to dress in black after the deceased's funeral. Marta was my dear friend, she explained. I can't forget her. We sat down at Pani Milotova's dining table and watched while she served tea from a samovar. She had left Russia before the revolution, and I had always been fascinated by her collection of lacquered boxes, Fabergé eggs, and bear figurines. When the tea was served, Aunt Josephine related Dr. Socek's words to Pani Milotova, whose face turned as green as the jade handles on the teaspoons. The pitch of her voice, an octave higher than normal, conveyed her shock. I arrived at the house at 11 o'clock to give Clara her lesson, she said. Marta had collapsed and Marie was leaving to fetch Dr. Socek. Milosh stopped her and scribbled down the address of Dr. Hoffman. When the doctor arrived, I was impressed at how he took control of the crisis." Pani Milotova paused, as if she was seeing the scene unfold in front of her. Then she continued. "He examined Marta and told us that emergency surgery was needed. Marie was dispatched to fetch Dr. Hoffman's nurse. I have medical training, I told him. I was a volunteer nurse during the war." He stared at me as if considering the proposition. "Then you know how to sterilize instruments?" he asked. I told him that I did, and that I would help in any way I could. Marta was anesthetized. I don't believe she felt a thing. Pani Milotova hesitated. A troubled look furrowed her brow. At the time, everything seemed professional, but I was struck by how little the doctor said to the nurse. I was with doctors during the war to clean wounds, and they were always giving me instructions, but Dr. Hoffman asked nothing of his nurse. The three of us fell quiet, wondering about this observation. Perhaps Dr. Hoffman and his nurse, having performed many operations together, did not need to speak. "Where was Milosh?" Aunt Josephine asked. Pani Milotova considered the question, then said, "He was pacing outside the door most of the time, but every so often he looked into the room. It was only when Dr. Hoffman had sewed Marta back up and she was starting to come to that he told us there was no hope." It was terrible to hear all these things about Mother's death, but I was compelled to find out the truth. After Pani Milotova had told us all she could, Aunt Josephine and I decided we would visit Dr. Socek and ask to see his medical records. Before we went to see the doctor, however, Aunt Josephine suggested we seek the advice of our family lawyer, Dr. Holub. Mother's final testament was not due to be read until the following week, so he was surprised when he saw us waiting in his office. "God be with you at this time," he said, leaving aside formality and embracing us. Dr. Holub had been Father's best friend and had a soft spot for our family. "What can I do for you?" Aunt Josephine related the story about Mother's appendix. Dr. Holub listened carefully, rubbing his bald patch with one hand and taking notes with the other. When Aunt Josephine finished speaking, he folded his hands under his chin, deep in thought. "It's possible the doctor misdiagnosed," he said, then tried to cover his mistake. "I will make some inquiries into his character and medical record. I will also see Dr. Socek myself." Dr. Holub reread his notes, and his face turned dark. He looked at me. "Your mother and stepfather, they were happy?" he ventured. Everyone knew that Mother and Milosh were far from happy, so I was taken aback by the chill the question sent through me. A thought that had not occurred to me until that moment gripped me like a vice. My breath caught in my throat when I tried to speak. I turned hopelessly to Aunt Josephine, who gave a better considered answer than I could. "The marriage was not a success. Marta hoped for a companion to relieve her loneliness and to be a father figure to her daughters, but Pan Dolezal did not fulfill those longings. He is simply too vain and too selfish. But if you are suggesting he plotted with Dr. Hoffman to kill Marta, especially in such a heinous way, I could not accuse him of that. Milosh is an overgrown child, not a murderer." Aunt Josephine's logic calmed my mind, and I began to breathe more easily. She was right. Milosh was a conceited fool, but not a villain. "Pani Dolezhalova's will is to be formally read out next week," Dr. Holub said to Aunt Josephine. "In the event of her death, she appointed you as the guardian of her children until the youngest of her daughters, Clara, comes of age. At that time, the fortunes of the Rudzika and Valenta families will transfer to the young ladies. Pan Dolezal is to receive an allowance until this time, with the expectation that his business will eventually make him self-sufficient." "I wonder if he knows that," asked Aunt Josephine. I think he was expecting to be kept in the event of Martha's death. Dr. Holub's eyes did not move from Aunt Josephine's face. He was trying to tell her something he did not want to say in front of me. But I could guess what it was. If my mother's will had not been altered since the time of her marriage to Miloš, then my stepfather would be the beneficiary should Clara and I both die before she reached 21. I found it difficult to sleep that night. My dreams were haunted by images of Mother dying, her grave covered in lilies, and Miloš. I felt no love for my stepfather, but his grief at Mother's death seemed sincere. Now Dr. Holub had put terrible ideas in my head, and despite Aunt Josephine's assurances, I could not forget them. Aunt Josephine looked as tired as I did the following day. Neither of us spoke over breakfast, which left the conversation up to Clara and Miloš, and they did not have much to say. Aunt Josephine had stayed with us since Mother's death, and I wondered, as she was to be our guardian, whether we would continue to live in our house or move to hers. Later in the morning, when I was in the courtyard garden, the question was answered. I heard Aunt Josephine talking with Miloš through the library window. "I understand that you are grieved by Marta's death," Aunt Josephine said, "but the funeral was a few days ago, and it is unseemly for you to continue to live under the same roof as your stepdaughters." Aunt Josephine was being tactful and treading carefully. Miloš answered immediately. "Yes, I have prepared for that. I have taken an apartment. But I hope that I will have your permission to call on the girls. I have grown fond of them." Miloš had never been fond of us, but perhaps he regretted his behavior towards Mother and wanted to make up for it. I did not hear Aunt Josephine's reply. But what could she have said? As unseemly as it would appear if Miloš continued to live under the same roof as us, it would be just as unseemly if all relations were suddenly cut off. "I will move my things tomorrow," Miloš promised. That night I tossed and turned and had nightmares again. Although Pani Milotova had assured me that Mother had been given sufficient morphine, I dreamt that she had been cut across the belly and was screaming. I woke with a start. What if Miloš had hired Dr. Hoffman to kill Mother? It was far less suspicious to die of a medical condition in the presence of a doctor than to be poisoned or stabbed. If Mother had been murdered in those conventional ways, the suspicion would have immediately fallen on Miloš. I thought about whether the police could do anything, and decided they probably could not, with only accusations and no evidence. Dr. Soucek's demand for an autopsy would also be fruitless. The violation of Mother's body would not prove anything. She would not have an appendix either way. Dr. Soucek would claim that he removed it years ago, and Dr. Hoffman would say he'd had the diseased organ incinerated. My head swam with the appalling possibilities, but in the end I kept coming back to one thing. Miloš was arrogant, self-seeking, and unpleasant, but was he capable of such an evil plan to get rid of Mother? I thought about Mother's last day and how she had seemed well when I wished her goodbye in the morning. A few hours later, she died in her bed. "Look in the chest." Goosebumps prickled my arms. Those had been Mother's last words to me. I had thought she was delirious and talking about a pain in her chest. Now I remembered the night she gave me Father's camera from his chest in the attic. I climbed out of bed and opened the door. The hall was dark and quiet. I did not need a lamp to guide me because the bathroom was at the other end and I knew the route there by heart. But I would need light to negotiate the attic stairs. I searched about for a candle, found one in the dresser drawer, and lit the wick. There were no ghosts in the hall, and I crept towards the attic stairs. I passed Miloš's bedroom and heard him sigh. A glimmer of light flickered beneath the door. He must be reading in bed, I thought. I held my breath and prayed that no creaking floorboards would betray me. The room felt closed when I entered it. My candle gave only a small circle of light, but I dared not turn on the switch as the new electric globe was twice as bright as those downstairs, and Miloš might notice it if he left his room to go to the bathroom. The chest was still there, but where was the key? I searched the drawers of Father's desk and under the rug, but had no luck finding it. I heard the door to Miloš's room open, then shut. I froze to the spot, listening for further sounds. But then I heard his feet on the floorboards and realized he had not left his room. I felt under the chest and found only cobwebs, then around the inkstand. My fingers touched the thin metal barrel of a key, and I grasped it with triumph. I tried it in the lock. It fitted. I lifted the lid gently so it would not make any noise. The smell of wool rose up from the chest, and then a sweet smell too. I recognized it as rosemary. Father used to drink an infusion of it every morning. He believed it improved his memory. He also laid a sprig of it on Mother's pillow on their anniversary each year as a symbol of his fidelity. Mother had tucked sachets of the herb around the sides of the chest. I held up the candle so I could see better, careful not to drop wax onto Father's uniform. I saw an envelope addressed to Aunt Josephine lying on top of Father's coat. The handwriting was Mother's. I picked up the envelope and found another one for Uncle Ota beneath it. The sound of footsteps on the attic stairs jolted me. I tucked the letter in my hand into my nightdress, closed the chest, and blew out the candle. I had just slid behind the armoire when the door opened and Miloš crept in, holding a lamp. I wondered if he had been disturbed by sounds in the attic and if he would smell the lingering scent of wax from the candle. Fortunately, the room held such a mixture of odors, dust, wood, musty cloth, they must have masked the wax, for Miloš seemed unaware of my presence. I had closed the chest, but had left the key in the lock, and the letter for Uncle Ota was still lying on top of Father's uniform. For a moment, I had an urge to reveal myself and make up some excuse for being in the attic, but something in the set of Miloš's face stopped me. I was not sure if it was a trick of the light, but the contours of his cheeks and chin looked sharper than usual. He did not turn on the electric light, but placed the lamp on Father's desk and began searching through the drawers. I realized that he had not come because he had heard a noise, but rather to look for something when he thought we were all asleep. When Miloš did not find what he was searching for in the desk, he turned to the shelf and leafed through the books. After the bookshelf yielded nothing of interest, he looked at the chest. My heart skipped a beat when he opened the lid, then picked up the lamp so that he might see more clearly into it. He discovered the letter and ripped open the envelope. Miloš showed no emotion while reading the letter. I was surprised that he could read correspondence from his late wife to the brother of her first husband so impassively. I understood little of men and women then, but knew enough to realize that men could be jealous. Miloš studied the letter like someone committing facts to memory for an examination. Every so often he would look up, his lips moving as if he were taking particular note of a place or name. When he had finished reading, I hoped he would discard the letter, but he rolled it into a tube and lit it with the wick of his lamp. The paper flared brightly, and I thought he was intent on burning the house down. But before the flame reached his fingers, he extinguished it. He dropped the remains to the floor and stomped on them before taking up his lamp again and leaving. I remained in my hiding place for half an hour after I heard the door to Miloš's room close, and quiet descended on the house. As dawn broke in the sky, shedding silvery light through the dormer window, I crept out and picked up the blackened remains of the letter. There was one piece that had been unharmed by the flame. I gently unfolded it, afraid it would crumble in my hand, and read the words my mother had written. Whispered of love the mosses frail, the flowering tree as sweetly lied. The rose's fragrant sigh replied to love songs of the nightingale. I recognized the lines. They were from the famous love poem, May. It was about a young man with an unfaithful lover. He kills his rival and later learns that it was his own father. I wondered why my mother would have included the poem in a letter to Uncle Ota. I leaned forward, and the letter Mother had addressed to Aunt Josephine jabbed me in the chest. Perhaps the answers would lie there. Aunt Josephine sat in the courtyard garden and read the letter from Mother. I chased Fripp around the fountain. I did it to keep warm, but also to stop myself from interrupting Aunt Josephine before she had finished. I thought she would call when she had read the letter, and was surprised when I turned around and saw her with the letter on her lap, staring out in front of her. One look at the grim expression on her face, and I understood it had revealed something terrible. Aunt Josephine? I sat down beside her. Fripp sensed the gravity of the moment and sat still. Aunt Josephine did not move. Whatever she had read in Mother's letter had come as a blow. "What is it?" I said, gripping her arm and feeling the tremor there. "Read it to me." She shook her head. "I can't. You must read it for yourself." And she handed me the letter. I was so afraid I had to inhale a few times before I could focus on the words. "Dear Josephine, I am writing to you because I know that you do not like to visit us when Miloš is at home, and, as you know, he is at home more often than not these days. At first I thought this change was due to a recovery of his devotion to me, or perhaps because he had given up the thorn in my side. For that immoral woman has ceased to appear at social functions, so I am free from her stares, and no longer reserve seats at the theatre so near to us that I can feel her breathing down my neck. Lida tells me that she has been seen folding bandages at the Veterans Hospital, an occupation much more suited to a widow of her position than pursuing other women's husbands. But it appears my husband's attention is not so endearing. He watches me with an interest that suffocates me. I cannot leave the house or make contact with a friend without a dozen of his questions. I do not flatter myself that this watchfulness is a sign of jealousy. No, he is studying me. But for what reason, I do not know. I have these spasms of anxiety in my stomach that the doctor cannot cure, although I know the cause, the daily state of being in fear. What is worse is that this watchfulness now extends to my daughters. He teaches Klarinka to play chess and Adelka to dance, but not from fatherly tenderness, as I had once hoped. I am sure he has some other purpose in mind. I have seen Emily in my dreams. She stands on the other side of a river and calls out to me, warning me of something, but I cannot hear what she is saying. My dear friend, I almost smile as I imagine you shaking your practical head, wondering if I am reaching the troublesome stage of motherhood when the children are growing up and one sees danger in every corner as a result of their increasing independence. But when I tell you what has provoked my anxieties, I am sure you will understand. Yesterday morning I awoke as dawn was breaking, having suffered another dream about Emily. The room was stifling, and I went to open the window. I looked down to the street and thought I must be hallucinating. There was that woman sitting in her car with her driver. At first I thought she might be preying on Miloš, but then I realized she was staring at the house. She was not regarding it as might a jealous mistress who has been shut out of her lover's domestic life, but rather as a woman admiring property that will soon be her own. Josephine, you know that if anything should happen to me, you will be the guardian of my daughters. An income, which I hope will be considered generous by you, has been set aside for this purpose. But I fear for my children's safety should they stay in Prague. Otto is a good man and so far away that I feel they will be out of danger with him and his wife. If you fear for their safety too, I beg you to send them to him. There is a matter between Otto and myself that has never been settled and which I have never discussed with you. But in his latest letter he inquired after me so kindly that I cannot but hope he has forgiven me. In any case, he seems to have a keen interest in the welfare of his brother's daughters. I have written to him expressing my hopes. I will explain all when I see you next. I will ask Adelka to take these letters to you, as for obvious reasons I do not wish my husband to have knowledge of this correspondence. Please come and see me as soon as possible, and please let Dr. Holub know that I would like to see him too. There are clauses in my will that I must amend immediately. All my love, Marta. I covered my mouth with my hand and leaned over. I retched, but could bring nothing up. Aunt Josephine gripped my arm. Marta knew he was going to kill her, she said. She only did not expect it to happen that day. I pressed my head into my hands, struggling to breathe. He must have given her something to make her collapse. Then they overdosed her with morphine. What we had found too terrifying to believe was real. The appearance of Pani Benyova in events explained everything. Chapter 4. Aunt Josephine and I showed Dr. Holub the letter, but his news threw us into confusion again. Dr. Hoffman has a perfect medical record, he informed us. He was decorated for his services during the war, and his nurse has been with him for 10 years. He has a beautiful wife and lives in a house in Vinohrady with glass ceilings and Italian Barocco-style furniture. He is not a candidate for being bribed into murdering for money. Aunt Josephine shook her head. Then what about Dr. Solchek's claim that he had already removed Marta's appendix? Dr. Holub shrugged. He is still insistent on that fact, and says that if Pani Dolejalova had died of a ruptured appendix, as Dr. Hoffman suggests, then the time from the onset of her symptoms to her death would have been a few days, not months. But when I asked him to show me the records, the operation was not entered. He said it may not have been included because at the time his wife was pregnant with their second child and was not feeling well enough to keep account of all his operations. How can he be certain then? I asked. He is getting old. Surely he does not expect us to trust his memory. Outside the window behind Dr. Holub, the leaves of the cherry trees had turned gold. The light flickered through them as the leaves were stirred by the breeze. Appendectomies were not common in Mother's Day, so Dr. Solchek may well be right that he remembered the operation, even if there were no records. It occurred to me that if he had not come to our house with his story about Mother's appendix, then we would be mourning her loss with peace and not suspicion. Dr. Solchek says he remembers it well because he operated on Pani Dolejalova the same night the German Emperor died. I leaned back and sighed. Dr. Solchek sounded senile. I had been sure of a conspiracy between Miloš and Pani Benyova, but that belief suddenly seemed not only unfounded, but ridiculous. Had Mother truly thought that Miloš was going to kill her? Or did she only fear that he and Pani Benyova would find a way to get us out of the house? Pain gripped my stomach, and I winced. I was suffering the same anxiety spasms that had afflicted Mother. "I fear this is too much for you," said Dr. Holub. I shook my head. "I want to know the truth." "What do we do now?" Aunt Josephine asked. "My nieces' lives may be in danger." Dr. Holub scratched his head. "There is nothing to be done for now," he said. "There is no evidence that Pani Dolejalova was murdered, despite her frightened letter. Only a confession would change things, and that is not likely to happen. You must watch Pan Dolejal carefully. He may give something away. The day that Mother's will was read, I studied Milosz's reaction. I noticed that Dr. Holub glanced at him when he read the part about Milosz being given an allowance. My stepfather did not bat an eyelid. "Your mother was a most generous woman," Milosz told me afterwards when we shared tea and cakes in Dr. Holub's office. "I shall always be grateful to her. Our marriage was short, but she brought me much joy." I winced. I resented being unable to speak my mind, but I had to tread carefully with Milosz. Aunt Josephine was our guardian until both Clara and I came of age, but the allowance to be paid to her for our care had to be signed off by Milosz as well as Dr. Holub at the bank each month. I understood why Mother had originally organized things that way. She did not think a woman should be troubled by money matters and had wanted to put Milosz in a fatherly position. But her good intentions had left us in a difficult situation. We were dependent on Milosz for our financial welfare until we came into our fortune. Later, Milosz asked Aunt Josephine about Clara's musical education and whether she would send us to finishing school abroad. Anyone listening to him would have thought him a devoted stepfather. I tried to read his mind, but could see nothing beyond his handsome face. But is that not what they say about cold-blooded killers? You can never tell them from ordinary human beings. On the surface, at least. If Milosz murdered us, how would he do it, I wondered? Would he use Dr. Hoffman again? Or would he simply strangle us in our sleep? Sometime later, Hilda, Aunt Josephine's maid who had come to stay with us too, informed us that there was a letter from Australia. Uncle Otto had sent us a pressed flower stem inside a sheet of tissue paper. Clara held it up, and we admired the plant's silvery green leaves and its balls of golden flowers. A fragrance similar to lilacs lingered in the paper. The envelope also contained a coloured drawing of the plant, Silver Wattle, by Ranjana. The accompanying letter from Uncle Otto asked that the flower be placed on Mother's grave. Although I had not seen Marta for nearly 20 years, I remember the vibrant young woman who was so devoted to her family, Uncle Otto wrote. Then, on a separate page, he had written, "In shadowy woods, the burnished lake darkly complained a secret pain, by circling shores embraced again. And heaven's clear sun leaned down to take a road astray in azure deeps, like burning tears the lover weeps." A shiver ran down my spine. They were lines from the poem May that followed those I had read in the remains of Mother's letter to Uncle Otto. It is ironic that he should quote Karl Heinrich Macher, Aunt Josephine told me when Clara was out of earshot. "Why?" I asked. "Because the poet is thought to have died of appendicitis, but mystery still surrounds his death." The months passed, but our pain did not. Clara worked on her pieces with Pani Milotova with an even greater intensity than before. Because she was sensitive, we kept Dr. Socek's claim from her. As a result, her grief followed a more even path than Aunt Josephine or I managed. I fell apart one afternoon when I found a hairbrush with Mother's blonde strands still intertwined in the bristles. Aunt Josephine did the same when she was rummaging through the sewing box and discovered a pincushion she had made for Mother when they were young. The only clue to Clara's inner anguish came when she practiced on her own. If she could not learn a piece by her third attempt, her playing descended into a tumble of chords, as though she was shrieking out her pain through her instrument. Yet on the surface she remained as calm as always. Milosz visited us on Christmas Eve. Aunt Josephine seated him in a chair opposite the sofa where she sat with Clara and myself. She would not leave him alone with us. Aunt Josephine and I were in two minds about my stepfather. If we never saw him again, we would not be sorry. On the other hand, we needed to watch him and see if we could find any clues as to whether he had played a role in Mother's death. For his part, Miloš may have been keeping up an appearance of caring about us to maintain propriety and divert any suspicion. More chillingly, he could have been trying to stay close enough so he could kill us. Miloš had brought presents. A wide-brimmed tea hat for Aunt Josephine, which I knew she would think too showy. A crystal lamb for Clara, which was ironic considering Miloš had no love for animals. And a gold necklace with a diamond pendant for me. I held up the chain, and the diamond sparkled in the lamplight. "I bought it for your mother, for our anniversary," said Miloš. "You are so much like her. I hope that its beauty flatters your own." My gaze drifted to the extra setting at the table. It was a Czech tradition to make a place for the recently departed, who we believed to be with us in spirit. I turned back to Miloš, but could not tell if the glimmer in his eye was a tear or a glint from the fire's light. We ate dinner in silence. The cook was away, so Hilda had prepared cabbage soup with potato salad and vannochka. Normally the soup was delicious, but with the tension in the air, it tasted bitter. Aunt Josephine did not lift her eyes from her bowl, and Miloš clenched his spoon so tightly that each time he moved it to his lips, the action looked mechanical. At last it was time for Miloš to leave. Despite our efforts to be hospitable, he had sensed that he was unwelcome. I watched him walk down the snow-covered street and remembered a proverb my father was fond of reciting. "Keep your friends close, but your enemies even closer." Not long into the new year, we received a letter from Uncle Ota and Ranjana. "To my dear ladies, I cannot tell you the joy the arrival of our boy has brought us. Ranjana was at her job at a stocking factory when this little one decided to arrive a few weeks early. Despite this, his lungs are strong and his fingers have a grip like a monkey's. He has my nose and chin, but I am happy to announce that he has his mother's eyes. He is the most delicious color, like a caramel toffee. Because he was born in Australia, we have decided to give him a distinguished English-sounding name, Thomas James. I have also changed my surname to Rose, as Rudzika is proving too difficult for anyone here to pronounce." Perhaps Uncle Ota had not told us that he and Ranjana were expecting a child because of the news of Mother's death. But after receiving the letter, Aunt Josephine set us to work knitting booties and jackets for our new cousin. "It's warm in Australia," Clara tried to explain. "It doesn't matter," said Aunt Josephine. "They don't have much money, and we must do what we can to help them." On the days Clara went to school, I walked her there. In the afternoons, she used to walk back with a group of friends, but since Mother's death, I met her at the school door and accompanied her home myself. If she did not have a music lesson after school, Clara and I visited patisseries and sweet shops on our way home. It was on one of these visits that I noticed the man. Clara and I were in Pani Yezhkova's patisserie, eyeing the vanilla rolls, poppy seed kolach, and cream puffs displayed on silver trays. We settled on linsa biscuits with marmalade centers and vanilla rolls dusted with icing sugar. Pani Yezhkova was no more than 4 foot tall and had to stand on tiptoes to see over the counter to take our order. She had the inquisitive eyes and well-rounded body of the animal from which her name derived. When she moved around the display, picking up the rolls and biscuits, I could imagine a hedgehog snuffling around a rose bush. Pani Jeżkowa made the best nut cake in Prague, and as we were expecting Pani Milotova to visit later in the afternoon, we bought one. Pani Jeżkowa turned her back to place the cake in a box. I heard the tinkle of the bell as the door opened, and another customer entered, bringing a breath of chilly street air with them. The newcomer hesitated before approaching the counter to stand beside us. I turned to see a man about Milosh's age. He was tall, thin, and dark in the face. His clothes were not the finest quality, but they fitted him well. His hair was combed and his face was shaven, but there was something about him that seemed out of place in Pani Jeżkowa's glistening mahogany and brass shop. I could not imagine someone with such a dour expression sinking his teeth into strawberry creams or sucking on vanilla buttons. Pani Jeżkowa handed me the cake box and our sweets wrapped in paper and wished us good day before greeting the man, who was staring at us with his pale eyes. I grabbed Clara's hand and hurried her out the door, but as soon as we were on the pavement I could not resist the temptation to look over my shoulder. Through the window, I saw that Pani Jeżkowa was trying to attract the man's attention, but he had his back to her and was watching us. On another occasion, I might have thought he was simply curious, but the man's half-smile sent a shiver down my spine. "Come on," I said to Clara, who was already munching on a biscuit. "We have to hurry home." After that encounter, Aunt Josephine or Hilda accompanied us everywhere. But one day, when Hilda had come down with a cold and Aunt Josephine was suffering a severe migraine, our aunt reluctantly agreed to let Clara and me go to a piano recital in the old town on our own. The pianist was a famous one from Hungary, and Clara did not want to miss the performance. "You walk across the bridge in view of the crowds and directly to the hall without dawdling or getting sidetracked," she told me. "Under no circumstances must you or Clara be alone." Spring was awakening, and the day was breezy. Clara and I held onto our hats as we passed the fishermen and pottery peddlers on our way across the Charles Bridge. "Let's put our hands on St. John," said Clara. Before I had a chance to stop her, she rushed towards the bronze statue and became caught up in a group of school children and their teacher. Legend has it that St. John of Nepomuk was trussed up in armor and thrown off the bridge at the order of King Wenceslas after he refused to reveal the Queen's confessions, the teacher announced to her students. "It is said that if you rub the statue, then one day you will return to Prague." "But we live in Prague," I muttered to myself, "and we are already late." I walked towards Clara, but before I reached her, a man stepped behind her. He turned to the side and I recognized his face, the man from the patisserie. My heart leapt to my throat. I bounded towards Clara and yanked her by the hand. "Why?" she protested, tugging against me. The man turned towards us. I dragged Clara away and broke into a run, still holding her hand. I was grateful she did not resist me this time, for she had seen the man too, and had sensed something was wrong. We dodged the cars and the people walking their dogs and the nannies pushing prams on the bridge. We were only a short distance from the tower to the old town, but Clara began to wheeze. She stumbled, and I stopped to catch her. We were two young girls who had run with all our might. I was sure we had lost the man amongst the traffic, but to my horror, he was almost upon us. Aunt Josephine had told us to stay with the crowds, but no one seemed to think anything of two girls being chased by a man. I saw a youth sketching pictures, but we would not have time to reach him and explain our situation before our pursuer caught up with us. There was a fruit and vegetable market near the tower, and I told Clara that we must run there. She took my hand again, and we weaved between the tables and boxes of cabbages and horseradish. On the other side of the market, I saw an inn. The cellar doors were open, and a man was loading beer kegs onto a cart. He was not looking, so I pushed Clara into the cellar and followed after her. We squeezed ourselves behind some full kegs, the coldness of the metal like ice burning our chests and cheeks. After a few moments, I saw the legs and boots of the man who had followed us. They stopped outside the cellar door. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like a rabbit with a fox sniffing outside its burrow. The man bent down and peered inside. From the way he was squinting, I realized that it was too dark in the cellar for him to see us. "Looking for something, sir?" I heard the cartman ask our pursuer. "Yes, I think my dog ran inside your cellar. Do you have a light?" The sound of the man's voice chilled me. I had been expecting a rough dialect of the street, but he spoke Czech like an aristocrat. He could have been someone Mother would have invited to afternoon tea. "I didn't see a dog run in there," replied the cartman, "and I've been standing out here the whole time." "Oh?" I hoped our pursuer would accept the cartman's word and move away, but he stayed put. "I did see 2 young girls running past, though," said the cartman. "Are they looking for the dog as well?" "Why, yes," said the man. "They are my nieces. You saw them?" My breath caught in my throat. I pulled Clara closer. "Yes," answered the cartman. "They nearly knocked me over. They ran down that way, back towards the river." "Thank you," said our pursuer. I waited a few seconds after the man's legs disappeared from sight, then told Clara to hurry out with me lest the cartman close the cellar doors on us. But before we could move, the cartman poked his head into the cellar and called, "Now, you rascals! I don't know what you stole from that gentleman, but I don't care. Run home now." Clara and I climbed out of our hiding place and made our way through the kegs to the door. "Go on, go," said the cartman, "and don't do it again." He did not need to tell us a second time. I grabbed Clara's hand and we ran with all our strength towards the bridge and the safety of home. When we reached our house, having missed the recital, I realized that Clara would need an explanation. I had never lied to my younger sister and did not intend to start. But how could I explain to her our suspicions about Miloš? She was 11 years old and had struggled valiantly with her grief over Mother. What would it do to her mind if I told her we suspected Mother had been murdered and that our lives were now in danger too? "It's not lying to protect a child's innocence," Aunt Josephine told me while Clara was washing her hands and face. "You must simply tell her that you are 2 wealthy young women in a town filled with thieves and that you recognized the man from a picture in the newspaper of an infamous thief known for robbing children." The fact that Clara believed my explanation with as much trust as she had taken my hand when we fled across the bridge earlier that day did not settle my mind. I lay next to her that night, trying not to imagine what the assassin intended to do with us once he caught us. I remembered his well-spoken voice and shivered. Then I thought about Dr. Hoffman, who I was now convinced had killed Mother. Miloš had the knack of finding gentlemen to do his dirty work. Did he know something about these men that other people did not? The weather at the beginning of spring was unpredictable, and even though the day had been breezy, it had also been warm. Then, after dark, the temperature reverted to winter and snow fell. At first it was light and dusted the roofs and statues with a fine powder. But then gusts of wind started to rattle out doors and windows, and the snow fell more heavily. The lights flickered, then went out. Aunt Josephine lit a lamp, and we read together in the parlor for a few hours before the room grew cold, and Aunt Josephine suggested that we go to bed. Fripp scratched at the door and stared at Aunt Josephine, who rubbed her eyes and yawned. "I'll take him outside," I told her. The courtyard garden was covered in snow, and I tugged my shawl around my shoulders. Fripp scampered to the flower bed and crouched. He did not like the cold either, so finished his business quickly. I was about to open the door so we could go back inside when he growled and circled my feet. I looked up and saw in the moonlight the silhouette of a man at the courtyard gates. I could tell from his stance that he was staring at me. My fingers trembled so badly that I could barely turn the doorknob. Finally, I managed to grasp it, and once Fripp was inside after me, I slammed the door shut. A few seconds later, there was a knock at the front door. I stifled a scream and ran to the bottom of the stairs. "Aunt Josephine!" I cried with all the voice I could muster, for I was breathless with fear. From the sound of the floorboards creaking above me, Aunt Josephine was preparing for bed and had not heard me. The knock sounded again. Fripp barked. The creaking of the floorboards stopped. Aunt Josephine must have heard it this time. I picked up the lamp Aunt Josephine had left for me and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. "Aunt Josephine!" I cried from the landing. The man I told you about is at our door." The knocking continued, becoming more insistent with each rap. Aunt Josephine appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightdress, a lamp in her hand. "One moment," she said, sounding as breathless as I did. I heard her open the door to the bedroom I shared with Clara and tell her to lock the door. "Don't let anyone in but me or Adela," she said. Aunt Josephine ran down the stairs. "Get Fripp's lead," she told me. I grabbed the lead from the hall stand and placed it around Fripp's neck. Hilda, who had been woken by the commotion, was already at the door. We had no time to warn her before she opened it, revealing the dark face of the intruder. He barged inside, shaking the snow off his coat. Fripp lunged forward, barking furiously. I was not sure whether to keep holding onto his lead or to let him go for fear he would choke. Hilda shut the door, but lingered near it. The man took off his hat and brushed the snow from it. He peered at us through the gloom. It was not the man from the patisserie, but another man, much older with stringy grey hair. "I've come to warn you," he said to Aunt Josephine. "Someone is after your nieces." He spoke with the lilt of a Polish accent. "Who are you?" demanded Aunt Josephine. "I am Heniotichka," the man answered, "but you will understand better if I tell you I am the stable manager for Dr. Hoffman and the husband of his nurse." Aunt Josephine and I responded to the man's statement with stunned silence. Eventually, Aunt Josephine gathered her will to invite the man into the drawing room and asked Hilda to make tea. Pan Tichka stared at the bronze horse on the mantelpiece before sitting down on the sofa. Fripp sniffed his boots. Then, sensing the danger had passed, sat by me. Hilda brought the tea and placed it on the table. After she had left, Aunt Josephine turned to Pan Tichka. "Well, you had better explain." Pan Tichka, who had refused to give his hat to Hilda and now sat with it clenched in his hands, wasted no time getting to the heart of the story. "Dr. Hoffman has debts, gambling debts. He lives elegantly, and his wife, who is expecting their first child, and his father-in-law have no idea of the depth of his trouble. That his home and riches are on the verge of being carted away by ruthless debt collectors. The desire to preserve his public image is a powerful motivation for an otherwise decent man to become a murderer. A man might do anything to save his own family, especially if the victim is painted to him as an adulteress and a cruel mother." I reached for Aunt Josephine's hand. She grasped mine. Pantichka had described a world different from the one we inhabited, a place where life was cheap. Pantichka studied our faces. "It looks to me that you have already guessed what I am going to tell you." The girl's stepfather furnished Dr. Hoffman's house. That's how they met. The doctor needed money quickly if he did not want to find his wife at the bottom of the river. The worst I had imagined was now confirmed. I felt ill when Pantichka verified Mother's death had been from an overdose of morphine. He told us that his wife had been so horrified at the deed performed by her employer, which she was unaware of until overhearing a conversation between Dr. Hoffman and Milos, that she ran straight to her priest. But her confession and prayers could not bring her peace. Then she overheard another conversation in which Dr. Hoffman was seeking an assassin on Milos's behalf. The idea of an assassin had seemed a fantasy when I thought about it. Now it was nightmarishly real. I longed to be a child again, when my world had been mother and father, puppet shows, and an adorable baby sister. My throat was raw, and I found it difficult to swallow. "Why?" I asked, unable to stop the tears falling down my cheeks. I was about to tell Aunt Josephine that money did not matter, that I would give my inheritance away to keep us safe. But what Pantichka said next changed my mind. "You do not have much time. It is your stepfather's mistress who is urging him on. She wants this house and hounds him daily about it." I imagined Pani Benyova sleeping in Mother's bed, poring over her jewels, sitting in her chair. Pani Benyova would not touch any of those things as long as I had breath in my body. "Will you go with us to the police?" Aunt Josephine asked Pantichka. If Aunt Josephine had stuck Pantichka with a needle, she could not have made him rise faster. "No, that is not what I have come for. That is not what I will do." "But surely your wife is religious," stammered Aunt Josephine. "Do you not think God needs to punish the men who killed a mother and now plot to destroy her daughters?" Pantichka backed towards the door and shook his head. "I have got the safety of a wife and 4 children to look out for. What you do to protect those girls is your business. I came to warn you, and I have taken a risk to do that. If you tell the police I said anything, I will deny it all." No amount of tears and offers of money could persuade Pantichka to change his mind. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and the snow was still falling when he bade us farewell. "I came and warned you," he said. "My conscience is clear. The rest is up to you." I remembered Clara was still in her room and ran upstairs. She opened the door, then retreated to the bed again, sitting with her knees to her chest and the blankets pulled around her. Aunt Josephine followed after me, her face grim. "It's all confirmed now, and there's nothing to do but what I dreaded most. I must send you girls away. God in heaven knows I'd do anything to keep you with me. You are like my own daughters. But I must think about your welfare, for it is better to have you far away and in safe hands than close by and in danger." The lamp I had placed on the side table flickered. The flame died, then ignited more brightly than before. "There," said Aunt Josephine, "it's your mother. She's telling me she agrees with my decision." "What decision?" asked Clara, her eyes wide with fear. She had no idea what had passed. Aunt Josephine grabbed our hands and squeezed them in her own. "I'm sending you to Ota." To Australia. Clara and I hardly had time to grasp what Aunt Josephine had said before Hilda appeared at the door. Aunt Josephine nodded to her. We must get them out of Prague without Miloš knowing. Chapter 5. The next weeks were full of secrecy and fear. Dr. Holub was our co-conspirator. He organized our passports through the British consulate, and correspondence from Aunt Josephine to Uncle Otto was to pass through him to avoid leaving a trail from her to Australia. I have booked tickets on a ship sailing to New York in the young ladies' names, as well as the passage to Australia, to throw anyone off the scent, he explained to Aunt Josephine when she and I went to see him to make the final arrangements. But there's one problem. Pan Dolejal will not be inclined to sign permission for the girls' allowance if he does not know where they are. What do you suggest? Asked Aunt Josephine. I can wire them money. Enough to last them until they are 21? Asked Dr. Holub. Aunt Josephine's inheritance was tied up in her house, and I was horrified at the idea that she might sell it in order to support us. I was relieved when Dr. Holub added, wiring money might be too much of a risk. Someone at the bank may contact Miloš and the girls will be traced. But I cannot ask Otto to support them, said Aunt Josephine. Is he so very poor? Asked Dr. Holub. He is not starving, said Aunt Josephine, but he is not well off either. Well, said Dr. Holub, send the young ladies with as much money as they can safely take with them. They will have to live simply until they come into their fortune. The important thing is to get them out of the country. I wish we could go to the police, I told Aunt Josephine on our way home. The flower sellers were out on the streets, and everywhere I looked there were buckets of roses, lilies, and daffodils. But the colours and scents of the flowers could not cheer me. We can't, without evidence or witnesses willing to testify, replied Aunt Josephine. We walked by Madame Bouquet's drapery, which had been Mother's favourite shop. We admired some glazed floral chintzes and gold-embroidered silks. Every time Mother and I had passed this way, we stopped to look at the fabrics. It occurred to me that I may never see the shop again. Everywhere I went in Prague these days, I was bidding some well-loved pleasure farewell. Won't you come with us? I asked Aunt Josephine. When we are gone, you won't be safe in Prague. What if Miloš threatens you to get information? I stopped. I could not bring myself to imagine what Miloš or the assassin might do to Aunt Josephine to make her talk. I have Hilda and Fripp, Aunt Josephine replied. I can't adapt to foreign countries, and I am too old to change. But you and Clara are young and speak English. Uncle Otto will look after you, I know that, and your mother knew it too. When Aunt Josephine used to read Uncle Otto's letters to us, I often thought that it would be marvellous to travel the world. I had not been anywhere outside of Czechoslovakia. My debut into society and my education in Paris and Florence had been halted by the war. But now that I was going away, I found the idea daunting. I thought of the wretched convicts the British had transported to Australia and imagined their faces peering through the ship's portholes at their homeland as it disappeared in the distance. Clara and I were not convicts, but we were fugitives. I recalled Pani Milotova's reaction when we had taken her into our confidence. "Australia," she said, her eyes wide with horror. "It's a wild place. What about Clara and her music? She will have to come back to study in Leipzig, otherwise she won't amount to anything." When we returned home, I found Clara sitting in the garden with Fripp. My sister was not the innocent child she had been until I was forced to tell her the truth about Mother's death and why we were leaving. The change was not in her smooth skin, her soft hair, or her agile hands. It was in the way she looked at things. There was hatred in her gaze, and I had never known Clara to despise anything. I sat down next to her and wanted to promise I would restore the joy she had once taken for granted. But I could not guarantee anything. I was unsure of the future myself. "What are you thinking about?" I asked her. She raised her eyes to meet mine. "When I am old enough, I will make Miloš and Pani Benjova pay for what they did." Her voice sent a chill through me. She did not sound like Clara anymore. "You've been brave," I told her, "and we must be careful to hide our feelings. You mustn't let Marie or anybody else know that we are leaving. We must behave as if everything is the same as it always has been." "It's not," said Clara, leaning down to pat Fripp's head. "Nothing will ever be the same without Mother." Clara was right. Even without the murder and the price on our lives, the chasm Mother's death had left would still be there. I longed to be reborn in another, happier life. I wanted to believe that might happen in Australia, but I doubted it. Clara and I might have been able to rebuild our lives in Paris, London, or somewhere in America. But the fifth continent? We may as well have been going to darkest Africa. The morning of our departure, Aunt Josephine and I waited in the parlour for Dr. Holub. He was to take Clara and me to the train station. The story given to our servants was that we were departing to our summer house early with Pani Milotova and her husband. Clara was sickly and needed fresh air and a change from Prague. We had a local maid in Doksy, and Marie would follow later. "I will keep visitors away and live here until I have received word you and Clara are in Australia," Aunt Josephine explained to me. "Then I will close up this house and put it in the hands of a caretaker until you return." Aunt Josephine planned to move back to her own house. She would be safer amongst her high society tenants than she would be living alone. The arrival of Pani Milotova and her husband in travelling dress added to the surreal atmosphere. "Dr. Holub has been delayed," Pani Milotova informed us. "An urgent business matter came up, but he will be here before 10 o'clock. Aunt Josephine glanced at her watch and frowned. "That will be cutting things fine. The schedule is tight." Clara appeared from the garden with some pearl d'or roses in her hands. "Look," she said, holding out the golden pink flowers. "They are starting to bloom." Pearl d'or had been Mother's favorite rose because of its fruity perfume. She had grown those in our garden from seed, but had never seen them come into flower. Pani Milotova put her arm around Clara. I hated my sister looking so drawn, but at least her appearance was convincing as an invalid in need of country air. Pan Milota asked me about my camera and mentioned the photographic exhibitions that would be showing in the warmer months. He was trying to relieve the tension, but his conversation made me sad. I would not be seeing exhibitions in Prague for many years. We heard a car pull up in the street and readied ourselves to leave. We were startled when Marie entered the room with Miloš. "Pan Dolejal is here," she said, looking annoyed that Miloš had not waited in the hall to be announced, even if he had lived in the house previously. "I came as soon as I heard," said Miloš. "Heard what?" asked Aunt Josephine, keeping her voice steady. "About Clara's illness." Miloš stepped towards Clara and knelt beside her chair. "I wish I had heard it from you first, Josephine," he said. "She is my stepdaughter." We had not seen Miloš since Christmas. He explained his absence as a business trip, but I suspected that he was lying low until his assassin had finished with us. It is a dreadful thing to face the killer of one's mother, and my hatred of him sent my heart thumping in my chest. I glanced at Clara. Her mouth was pinched into a tight ball. We were so close to foiling Milos. I prayed she would not do anything to give us away. Milos put his arm around her. "I have a better offer than boring old Doxy," he said. "I will take my stepdaughters to Venice." I glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 9:45, and Dr. Holub would be arriving at any minute. The train to Genoa was due to depart at 23 past the hour. "They can't go anywhere with you without a chaperone," said Aunt Josephine, "and I am not going to Venice." Milos had taken this into account. "But you weren't going to Doxy either," he said. "I'm sure that Pan Milota and his wife would prefer Venice." "The main concern is Clara and her health," said Pani Milotova. "Venice is full of rats and cholera. She needs fresh air." Milos turned his back to us. "What do you have to say for yourself, Clarinka?" he asked in an affectionate tone that he'd never used on her before. "Where do you want to go?" Clara lifted her chin and looked into Milos's eyes. "Stepfather, you are kind, but perhaps we can go to Venice in the summer." "Well, that's an idea," Milos said, a victorious note in his voice. He was oblivious to how Clara had triumphed over him with self-control. Marie opened the door and Dr. Holub strode into the room, bringing us back to our senses. His eyes narrowed on Milos. Aunt Josephine explained that he had made an offer to take Clara and me to Venice. Dr. Holub's expression remained calm, but I wondered if he was thinking the same thing I was. Milos had intended to arrange some sort of accident in Venice. Dr. Holub put our suitcases and those that Pani Milotova and her husband had brought as decoys in the car. Milos lingered, and I thought he was going to offer to join us for the drive to Doxy. But after Dr. Holub had turned the motor, he waved and said, "See you in the summer, then." It was difficult to be sure how much Milos knew about our plans. He had read Mother's letter to Uncle Otto before destroying it, and Mother had said that if we were in danger, she wanted us to go to Uncle Otto. But did Milos know that Uncle Otto was in Australia, or would he believe he was in America? It was terrible to be making the long journey without being sure that we would be any safer in our new home. Milos's unexpected visit had left us with little time for goodbyes at the station. Clara and I had only a few minutes to farewell the people who meant so much to us and who we would not see for many years. I pulled out my camera to take a picture, but the conductor whistled and called us aboard. Hilda, too, as she was accompanying us to Genoa. "Goodbye," Clara and I called from the train window. My last glimpse of Prague was Aunt Josephine weeping on Pani Milotova's shoulder, and the stained glass windows of Hlavní nádraží station. For nearly 2 months, the first things I saw on opening my eyes every morning were the fan above my bed and the thermos flask that sat in a holder above the wash basin in our cabin on the ship bound for Australia. We had boarded in the morning after a night in a backstreet hotel in Genoa, where we had sat with the lights off. In my dreams, I saw Milos hiding in the crevices behind the armoire and under the desk, waiting to snatch Clara away from me. It was a relief when we finally stood at the gangway to the ship and saw the steam flying from its funnels. "Look after your sister," said Hilda, adjusting my scarf to fit more snugly around my throat. She took the cross from her neck, kissed it, and placed it in my hand before bending down and stroking Clara's cheek. "And God be with you both." Once we had climbed the gangway, Hilda did not wait to see the ship depart from the dock. That might have drawn attention to us should Miloš have a spy among the crowd bidding farewell to their relatives. I watched Hilda's stout figure disappear into the throng, my hand clutching the cross that was still warm with her body heat. When I could no longer see her and the ship began to move, I felt like a drowning person being washed out to sea. Buon viaggio! Buon viaggio! The passengers were mostly Italians making their way to Australia for work or disembarking at one of the ports along the way. We would have liked to speak to them, even though their dialects were often different from the literary Florentine our mother had taught us. But fear of being traced and found out made us reserved about who we spoke to, even amongst the other first-class passengers. Our journey passed slowly, measured in sunrises and sunsets. Aunt Josephine had asked us not to leave the ship to visit the ports, so Clara and I wrote a list of activities to keep ourselves occupied. We crammed the schedule with as many occupations as possible and listed them at breakfast as if each one were a delight to look forward to, although we did them every day. Walk the promenade deck. Read The Wind in the Willows out loud to each other to practice English. 2 games of shuffleboard. 2 games of quoits. 1 game of chess. Listen to ship's orchestra at afternoon tea. Take a photograph of something we have not noticed before on the ship. Clara to read and hum music for an hour. Adela to write a page in her journal. To dispel our boredom and relieve our fears, Clara and I mostly relied on our imaginations. "What are you doing?" I asked one afternoon when I woke up from a nap to find Clara sitting before her berth and lifting and dropping her fingers on the side of it. "I'm playing Chopin's Nocturne, Opus 72, she answered. "What are you doing? It looked like you were sleeping." I sat up and wriggled my feet. "I wasn't sleeping. I was at the markets." She smiled. "Which markets?" "The ones in Colombo." "See?" I held out my arm to her. "Smell my sleeve. It's infused with the scents of saffron and turmeric." "Did you bring me back anything?" "Of course I did." I took the clasp from my hair and handed it to her. "I brought you this silver-engraved bangle." Most of the time, Clara and I were content in our self-contained world. But at other times, the isolation of our existence and our fear of our stepfather became unbearable. Once, after the ship had docked at Port Said, Clara was convinced that Miloš had boarded. We were walking along the promenade deck when she clutched my arm. "It's him!" "Who?" I asked, looking at the passengers sitting in the deck chairs, reading books or sleeping. "Miloš!" My heart skipped a beat. I examined the faces and found no one who resembled our stepfather. "Clara, are you all right? Have you had too much sun?" Clara did not answer me. I tugged her sleeve, and she stared at me as if she did not recognize who I was. There was a distant look in her eyes. She was like a stranger, and that was even more frightening to me than being pursued by Miloš. We sailed into Sydney Harbour on the last day of May. The sky was the same brilliant duck-egg blue as the sky in Prague, but the sunlight was brighter. It sparkled off the crests of the waves that swirled around our ship, the funnels, and the decks. We leaned over the railing to catch a glimpse of the city. The intensity of the light made me squint. I searched the foreshores for the buildings Uncle Otto had described, but all I could see were stone outcrops from which sprouted trees with white trunks and silvery green leaves. Some of the headlands had been cleared, but many were lush with shrubs and trees. I gripped the railing. "This is our new home for the next 10 years, I told myself. The customs procedure at the port was not as arduous as I had feared, and we were not given the dictation test. Having Uncle Otto as our guarantor and the letter of support Dr. Holub had obtained from the British Consul General had helped. Clara and I were the first passengers to emerge into the sea of faces waiting to greet the ship. A man moved towards us. He was so tall he had to stoop under the arrivals banner. Following him was a woman with dark skin holding a baby. Until that moment, Uncle Otto had been a man with his arm around my father in photographs and in stories read out by Aunt Josephine. Ranjana and Thomas had been characters in a dream. Now Clara and I were about to meet them in the flesh. When they reached us, Uncle Otto removed his hat and clutched it to his chest. It was frayed at the edges, and there were dark spots on the crown. Gentleman's spots, Mother had called those marks on a man's hat, because they suggested that the wearer was prone to lifting his hat frequently, especially to passing ladies. "You are the image of your mother," Uncle Otto told me. "I could see straight away that you are Martha's daughter." I wanted to cry and laugh at the same time. Uncle Otto's voice was just as I had imagined it would be. Warm, debonair, charming. He looked young for a man in his late 40s, with a smatter of freckles across his cheeks and a mass of tousled hair framing his inquisitive face. "Yes, I am Adela," I said, standing on my tiptoes to receive his kiss. "And this is Clara." Uncle Otto turned to Clara and stopped in his tracks. His eyes danced over her face as if he were in some sort of dream. "Emily?" he muttered. Clara climbed on top of her suitcase so she could put her arms around Uncle Otto's neck. He must have noticed the puzzled look on my face and recovered himself. "I am pleased to meet you, lovely Clara," he said, returning her embrace. "My sister often writes about your exceptional talent." Uncle Otto turned to the woman and child. "Let me introduce you both to my wife and son." After the exotic images I had kept in my head about Ranjana, I was surprised that she was wearing a simple floral dress, flat shoes, and spectacles. Rather than the Oriental princess I had imagined, she could have been the librarian of a ladies' college, if she was not so dark-skinned. But the proud tilt of her chin and the way she stood with her feet balanced on the ground and her shoulders straight did give her a regal bearing despite her plain clothes. "Dobry den. Moc mnie cieszy, że was, nebo tebe, poznawam," she said in Czech. She was pleased to meet me. I was astonished to hear perfect pronunciation from someone whose native language was so different from my own. "Děkuji. Jsem ráda, že jsem tady," I replied. "Thank you. I am glad I am here." Ranjana held up Thomas, who was fat and, although not as dark as his mother, had her bright eyes. He gurgled and swiped at my cheek. Uncle Otto suggested that we take a couple of hansom cabs to his house. "There is no more elegant way to be transported in Sydney," he said, leading us to a line of horses and ebony carriages. "Watson's Bay," Uncle Otto told the driver at the head of the line. The doors to the cab were open, and Clara and I peered at the shabby leather seats and faded carpet. The driver swung his head and saw Ranjana. He shut the cab doors, almost catching Clara's fingers. My cheeks burned with shame, but I acted as if I had not noticed, to avoid embarrassing my aunt. Ranjana stood with her eyes straight ahead, as if the driver's reaction had nothing to do with her. Uncle Otto put his arm around his wife. "What a rude fellow," he said. "Horses are nice, but I don't think we want to give someone of that level of intelligence our money. Do you, my dear?" Before Ranjana could answer, a voice came from behind us. "I can take you." We turned to see a man with a red face and an upturned nose leaning out of a motor taxi. "I can fit you all in here." I tried to place his accent. Russian? Polish? It was hard to tell because some of his words had taken on a nasal tone that was not part of either of those languages. The taxi was newer than the hansom cab and in better repair. The seats were plush and the chrome trims were polished so brightly that I could see my reflection in the wheel guard. "Ha!" said Uncle Ota, "never stoop to answer a slight, and soon the truth will come to light." Ranjana's face broke into a smile, and Uncle Ota stepped towards the taxi. He offered the driver a price, and they haggled good-naturedly until they agreed on the fare. The driver stepped out of the car to open the doors for us and put our luggage in the boot. Ranjana and Thomas sat in the front with Uncle Ota, while Clara and I climbed in the back. Uncle Ota opened the window and said loud enough for the hansom cab driver to hear, "I have changed my mind about the most elegant way to travel, and this is it. In a hansom cab, one feels oneself too close to the horse's backside." He let out a booming laugh. The hansom cab driver's nostrils twitched, and he turned away. The taxi driver put his foot on the accelerator. Clara clasped my hand and squeezed it. At first I thought she was frightened, but she stared out the window, fascinated by the chaos that was unfolding around us. The streets were congested with every form of transport, all travelling at different speeds. At one intersection, a policeman tried to exert control over the mayhem, but his gestures were futile. The barrowmen, pushing their trays of fruit and flowers, got in the way of the cars, whose drivers beeped their horns and shook their fists to no avail. A tram rattled across our path with a horse and dray clomping after it. And everywhere were block boys, risking their lives to dart among the traffic and shovel away horse manure. I was intrigued by the people on the footpaths. Some were dressed in dove-grey suits or pleated drop-waist dresses, but most looked like workers. There were men in checked shirts with their sleeves folded to the elbows, and women, both young and old, in aprons and white stockings. We passed a grocery store where a man in overalls was painting a window with an advertisement for Bushel's tea, while opposite, another man was scraping away one for Mother's Choice flour. Before long, we found ourselves passing along serpentine lanes lined by terraced houses, whose front doors opened straight onto the street. There was something seedy in the reek of damp and mud, and the way the pale children stared at us from gutters and doorways. "There are slums in this city as poor as those in London," Uncle Ota explained over the noise of the engine. "You'd never come this way at night. Gangs roam the streets, ready to slit your throat with a razor for a bit of money." I gulped, my fingers instinctively reaching to protect my neck. But before I knew it, we were out in the open air again. My glimpse of the dark side of Sydney was forgotten as we travelled along a road bordered by walls covered in ivy. Beyond them we could see mansions with shingled roofs and bay windows. There were 40-foot-tall maple-like trees on either side of the road, crimson in leaf, and pink-orange-barked trees with sinuous limbs that Ranjana said were called red gums. Before long the vegetation thinned, and we found ourselves passing through rocky terrain. Bungalows sat on blocks of lawn with nothing to differentiate them except the position of their rusty water tanks. The only relief from the starkness was an occasional glimpse of the sea. A few miles on, Uncle Ota directed the driver to turn into a narrow street with houses on one side and a low forest on the other. Dozens of brightly coloured parrots squawked and somersaulted on a tree with leathery leaves and golden flower spikes. Two broke away from the group and swooped low over the taxi's bonnet. "Rainbow lorikeets," said Clara, pressing her face to the glass. "We studied the book you sent us," I explained to Uncle Ota and Ranjana. The taxi stopped outside a weatherboard cottage bordered by a picket fence. A large black bird with a white nape and underwings sat near the letterbox. "Magpie or currawong?" Ranjana asked Clara. "Magpie," Clara answered. "Currawongs have black necks." The driver removed our luggage from the boot while Uncle Otter opened the passenger doors for everyone. He gestured towards the house. "Welcome to our humble home," he said. Paint curled in flakes from the cottage's walls. The roof was mottled with rust patches, and the stairs to the front door were cracked. But the house had a strange charm. A camellia tree with soft pink flowers decorated the tiny front yard, with a cheery border of marigolds along the fence. The 2 front windows were framed by green shutters, which made it look as if the house had a face with eyes, and the door was its nose. After Uncle Otter had paid the driver, Ranjana opened the front door, and we tramped in single file down a corridor whose sole light came from the kitchen at the end of it. The kitchen had been painted primrose yellow and had a modern stove, but when we were seated at the table, I noticed the ceiling was soot-stained and that the enamel cups Ranjana placed before us were chipped. I glanced at Clara and wondered what she was thinking. The house was a few steps down from the way we had lived in Prague. But my sister seemed happy and did not take her eyes from Thomas, who Uncle Otter was bouncing on his knee. Ranjana set down a plate of scones on the table, along with vanilla slice. Clara picked up the pot of sweet-smelling jam that Ranjana had placed next to a bowl of cream. "It's lily-pilly," Ranjana told her, "to put on the scones." "I am a vegetarian," replied Clara, in English, and with so much dignity I wanted to laugh. Ranjana patted her head. "I made it from the berries of the lily-pilly tree in our back garden. I'm a vegetarian too, so we'll get along fine." After we had finished our afternoon tea, Ranjana showed Clara and me to the room we were to share. It was the second largest room in the house and faced onto the street, but it was still tiny. 2 single beds had been crammed against each other, but there was barely room to open the doors of the battered armoire. I could see Ranjana had tried to make the room cozy, with a vase of marigolds on the side table and a magenta sari in place of curtains at the window. My legs trembled, and I sat down on the bed. "Are you all right?" Ranjana asked. "Just sea legs," I said, trying to shake off the fainting spell. I knew my lack of balance was not because my legs were unused to land, but because the room was confirmation that this was our life now. Prague was far away, and Mother was gone forever. When I felt better, Ranjana continued with the tour of the house. Uncle Otter, Ranjana, and Thomas shared the room next to ours. The bath was in the laundry shed in the long, narrow garden at the rear of the house. Next to this, standing in a shed of its own, was the toilet. I was the first to use it. Considering it was only a seat with a pan, it did not smell as bad as I had feared, and the chilly breeze under the door seemed to ventilate it. A picture of a white-tiled and brass-fitted bathroom from Home magazine was pasted to the back of the door. I took it to be an example of Uncle Otter's humour. Next to the toilet was a basket filled with squares of torn-up newspaper, the use of which I did not need to guess. A hairy spider had fixed itself in a web in the corner of the roof. No doubt Clara would be fascinated by it, but I sat the whole time with the fear that it would spin down a line of web and land on my head. After Clara had made use of the dunny, as Uncle Otter called it, Ranjana showed us the room at the rear of the house. It was the largest room, and from the joins in the walls, it looked as though a sitting room, a third bedroom, and an enclosed balcony had been combined. Here, between its Victorian-style red walls, Uncle Otter kept the treasures he had collected from his travels. There was a Turkish pipe and an African drum leaning against a stone elephant in one corner, and an ostrich egg perched on a stand in front of a gold mirror in another. On the shelves stood miniature wooden dolls with primitive faces and human hair. Glass cabinets held collections of books, African masks, maps, Chinese scrolls, and shells labelled into their classification families. 2 cabin trunks served as side tables. Uncle Otto opened them to show me his collection of glass plate negatives stacked together. From the number of photographs of temples and palaces that adorned the walls, I could see he was as keen about photography as I was. The most macabre object in the room, besides the medieval cauldron, was a set of jaws 4 feet high and 5 across, with serrated teeth. Uncle Otto saw me looking at it and explained that it had come from a shark that had been caught off the shore from Gibson's Beach, which was down the road. I shivered at the thought of such a monster lurking under the surface of the sea. I was surprised when Uncle Otto said, "The fishermen should have let it go. Sharks are the keepers of the ocean." Uncle Otto tapped the floor in the corner of the room nearest the back window. "We shall place your piano here when it arrives, Clara," he said. "The acoustics will be good, and the floor won't give way." The following day, because he did not have to work at the Australian Museum, where he was in charge of dusting shelves and mopping floors, until the afternoon, Uncle Otto led us on an expedition around the harbour shoreline and showed us rock pools where we found anemones, worms, sponges, snails, and fish of every colour living amongst the ribbon-like seaweed. He also took us to the Royal Botanic Gardens, where we stretched our necks to look at the fig trees and Norfolk Island pines, and wandered around the lawns, duck ponds, and rose gardens, with the backdrop of the harbour beyond them. Clara was captivated by the grey-headed flying foxes that gathered in the palm groves. There were so many of them that the trees looked black. "They are intelligent animals and vegetarians like us," Ranjana told her. "They eat berries and blossoms and are pollinators of native plants. If you look closely, you will see some of the females have a young one tucked under their wing. They invite sporting clubs in after the park closes to shoot the poor creatures," said Uncle Otto. "Why?" I asked. "Because they eat the exotic plants," Ranjana answered, hoisting Thomas higher up in her arms. "But there are other ways to deter them. They hate sudden loud noises." "I've never understood why my sex finds it so terribly manly to slaughter harmless creatures," said Uncle Otto. "If you want my opinion, women are superior in respecting life." "Because we are the ones who work so hard to bring it into being," said his wife. Clara did not take her eyes from the colony of bats. She leaned against the trunk of a giant angophora. "Australian trees are so beautiful. Why would you want to plant anything exotic?" she said. "I wonder what would happen if the hunters were hunted." Uncle Otto gazed at Clara for a long time. I thought he might be intrigued by her perception of things. Her commitment to vegetarianism had forced me to examine my own attitude to animals. "Everything on this earth is connected," she had told me. "If we harm other living creatures, we ultimately harm ourselves. As long as we show them no compassion, we ourselves will continue to suffer in our minds and bodies." As it turned out, her belief protected us from the only outbreak of disease on our voyage to Australia, an eruption of food poisoning attributed to the salted beef. Uncle Otto looked as if he were going to ask Clara to elaborate on what she meant, but Ranjana reminded him that he had to be at the museum in 10 minutes. "Yes, that's right," said Uncle Otto, shaking his head as if Ranjana had woken him from a dream. I looked from Clara to Uncle Otto, and wondered what it was about my sister that so entranced him. Chapter 6. Prior to our arrival in Australia, Uncle Ota had received a letter from Aunt Josephine dated 2 days after our ship had departed from Genoa. It had been prompted by Hilda's report of our safe boarding. Clara's piano arrived not long after we did. According to the shipping notice, it had been sent by Dr. Holub 3 weeks after Aunt Josephine's letter. Since the letter and the piano, we had heard nothing. I waited for the postman every day, twice a day, for news from Aunt Josephine. Each time I was disappointed. By July, I had stopped waiting and started praying that she was safe. For the first month in Sydney, Clara and I had been nervous. We jammed our bedroom window closed and jumped each time we heard someone open the front gate. But we soon learned that in Sydney there was always someone opening the front gate. Firstly, at dawn, the milkman arrived with the clink of glass bottles. He returned in the afternoon with butter and cream. Then there was the iceman, who came rain or shine with a slab of ice on his back. The postman blew his whistle twice daily, and the baker's visit was heralded by the scent of fresh bread and the clop-clop of his draught horse. The clothes prop man sold us gum saplings to support our washing line, and there was also the scissors and knife sharpening man, the cobbler, the sanitary man, the newspaper boy, and the travelling salesman, who arrived each week with a suitcase filled with fountain pens, sponges, candles, needles and threads, and mosquito coils. Once a month, the bottle man announced his beer delivery at the gate with the cry, "Bottle-o!" Like most Czech men, Uncle Ota preferred beer to wine or spirits. "You can't be a hermit and live in Australia," Clara said. "No," I agreed. In Prague, we had become used to not going anywhere alone. So when Clara began attending school, I rode with her on the tram to Waverley every morning and was there to pick her up at 3 o'clock each afternoon. "You have to stop that," Ranjana told me one afternoon when she was showing me how to bake naan bread. "You must stop living in fear." That was impossible to do. Uncle Ota had not written to Aunt Josephine because he wanted to wait until he had word from her. Each morning I awoke with questions running through my mind. How did Milos react when he found out we were gone? Did he threaten Aunt Josephine? Was he trying to trace us? Had he been tricked by the decoy tickets to America, or was he on his way to Australia right now? "You can believe me," Ranjana said, kneading the dough. "I know about fear." I watched her divide and roll out the bread. Ranjana had beautiful hands, strong but graceful. I had seen pictures of Indian people in books and had thought they looked fragile, but not Ranjana. She was like a tree rooted in the ground. I could not imagine her being afraid of anything, but I understood that the sati pyre had left scars, if not on her body, then on her soul. To ease my mind, I threw myself into photography. I took pictures of the native birds, and Ranjana collected leaves and flowers for me to photograph for her botany books. I also did portraiture. "You capture the essence of your subjects beautifully," Uncle Ota told me, "as well as things others perhaps would not notice, such as Ranjana's penetrating glance and Clara's sylph-like hands." He was surprised to learn that I had never developed my own photographs and relied on studios to produce my prints. "My dear Adelka, development is half the art," he said. "Follow me." Uncle Ota led me into the back garden to the laundry shed. Next to the copper and wash tub was an enlarger fashioned from tins. The windows and doors had black curtains on them to block out the light. "The chemicals and trays are here," Uncle Ota said, indicating a crate on the floor. "I'll give you a lesson in the process, but the art You can learn by yourself. Use this room any time you like, except Mondays, when Ranjana does the laundry." Ranjana returned to work at the stocking factory and left Thomas in my care. She and Uncle Ota took afternoon shifts, and Uncle Ota worked some evenings as well. I had put some of the money Aunt Josephine had given me aside to pay Clara's school fees and for musical tuition once we had found a suitable teacher. I wanted to give the rest to Uncle Ota, but he refused to take it. "Hold on to your money," he told me. "You might need it. And we have all that we need here." It was a strange thing that Ranjana and Uncle Ota worked hard and had few material items, and yet lived more abundantly than some of the richest families in Prague. They never went to balls or parties, yet their lives were filled with more good humor and fun than I had seen in any damasked and gold-leafed parlor. One afternoon, Clara and I were collecting the washing from the line in the back garden when I sensed someone watching us. I turned to see a woman peering through the pencil pines that bordered our house and our neighbors. She was so pale that if I had not known better, I would have thought her a ghost. The woman was perhaps 3 or 4 years older than Ranjana, but in her brown house dress and with bags under her eyes, she looked worn out. "Hello," I said. The woman started. Despite her appearance, her eyes were bright and alert. "Hello," she replied. Her mouth trembled as if she would like to say more, but she thought better of it and turned on her heel and scurried away. "How extraordinary," Clara said. "She's like a little mouse." "That's Esther," Ranjana explained when she returned home. "The daughter of the woman we rent the house from. She's terribly shy. I think it's the strain of looking after her mother. The woman has been blind for 10 years. Lonely souls need comfort, Mother always said. She had won Father's admiration and irritated Milosh by visiting neighbors who were suffering misfortune. She could not help herself. She had been born with a generous heart. I decided that I did not just want to look like my mother, I wanted to emulate her. So, the following afternoon, Clara and I decided to visit our reclusive neighbor. We packed a basket with jars of Ranjana's lily-pili and kumquat jams and headed next door. The house that Esther and her mother shared was twice the size of ours, with a second story, but was much drearier. In the front garden, a fountain had crumbled into mouldy ruins overrun by ivy, and the veranda was a mass of cobwebs, with tree roots poking through the boards. But the back garden, from what Clara and I had managed to glimpse through the gaps in the paling fence, was an overgrown Eden of silver gum and bloodwood trees knotted with flannel flowers, lilies, and lantana. We would have loved to explore it. I knocked on the door. A butterfly with turquoise wings rimmed in black flitted over my wrist to the knocker, then off again. The creature was a thing of beauty set against the shabbiness of the house. We heard feet shuffling down the hall. The door opened a crack, and Esther peered at us. "We wanted to introduce ourselves to you," I told her. "I am Ota Rose's niece, Adela, and this is my sister, Clara." If Esther heard me, she did not acknowledge it. She stared at us without saying a word. Clara held up the basket of jams, and Esther looked at it as if she did not know what it was. A mouse, Clara had called her. I half expected Esther to sniff the contents, twitch her nose, then run away. "We will leave the basket here," I said, pointing to a dusty table on the veranda. Esther's shyness was crippling, and I did not want to impose on her too long. But to my surprise, a smile came to her face. With her small face and large eyes, she was a pretty woman, but the dowdy clothes and unkempt hair hid it. "You play the piano?" she asked me. "Clara does," I replied. "It's beautiful," Esther said. "It gives Mother a lot of pleasure." We had to take care that the sea air and the dramatic temperature changes of late winter did not put the piano out of tune, but from that day on we opened the window a crack whenever Clara sat down to play piano. On my 19th birthday, we were celebrating with a chocolate cake in the back room when Clara looked out the window and noticed that a window in Esther's house had opened a crack too. The following month, when the temperature steadied, both windows opened to halfway. Then, in October, Esther opened her window all the way and took down the curtains. When the light was at a certain angle, we saw an elderly woman reclining in a chair with her back towards the window. One day, a note appeared in our letterbox. "Mother says that you are rushing the fugue. You should try to play it more evenly." Then the following day, another message arrived. "Mother says that if you want to achieve a singing sound, you must relax your arms more. Move your fingers as little as possible from the keys and follow every movement of them with a downward and upward motion of the arm." After that, a note appeared that read, "Acquiring a good technique is as much a mental process as a physical one. Make sure you do not let your mind wander." This was soon followed by, "Before you start your piece, sit in front of the piano and imagine how you will play it from start to finish. If this makes you feel impatient, you must keep doing this until you can sit before your piano and be relaxed. Never be in a rush to commence your piece without having settled your mind first. This is the reason you are playing the Schumann too fast." The tuition from Esther's mother proved right. Whenever Clara applied the advice, the quality of the piece she was practicing improved. After a while, we could not contain our curiosity. "Esther," I wrote at the bottom of one of the notes before returning it to the letterbox, "Clara and I should very much like to meet your mother. We would like to thank her for the help she has been giving Clara." There was no reply with the following day's note, but the morning after that, when I was leaving to go to the grocery shop, I found Esther hovering near the gate. She was wearing a wool skirt that rolled around the hemline and a brown sweater. "Mother says you can come at 3 tomorrow afternoon," she said. She trembled when she gave the invitation and seemed relieved when I said that we would be there. She turned to go, and a blue butterfly like the one we had seen near her door appeared. It rested on her shoulder, unnoticed by her, before flying off again. Ranjana was making chocolates and told us that we could take some for our visit to Esther and her mother. Clara and I watched Ranjana blend the chocolate, vanilla and milk and pour the mixture into heart-shaped molds. I thought of Prague, where the house had smelt of roasting cocoa beans for days before Mother blended her chocolate. Uncle Ota arrived home and tried to taste a piece before it had set. Ranjana shooed him from the kitchen. "Thomas is better behaved than you," she said, and chased him down the hall with a saucepan, laughing. Given the run-down appearance of the house, I expected the interior of our neighbour's home to be as decrepit, and to find Esther's mother sitting amongst cobwebs and dust like Miss Havisham in Dickens's Great Expectations. So when Esther opened the door for Clara and me and invited us in, I was surprised to find that the house was orderly, although gloomy. We followed Esther down a corridor, past bedrooms with the curtains drawn, but with enough light seeping in to catch glimpses of neatly made four-poster beds and carved mahogany wardrobes. We arrived at a room at the back of the house where Esther's mother was sitting. She wore a black dress with leg-of-mutton sleeves and a high collar. When she heard our footsteps, she turned in our direction. Her eyes were cloudy. I had seen the condition in an old dog once. It was cataracts, and there was nothing that could be done about them. "Mother, your guests are here," Esther said. Her mother nodded. Her skin was wrinkled, with deep crevices running from the corners of her mouth to her chin. The lines gave her the comical appearance of a ventriloquist's doll, but there was nothing humorous about the woman. "I am Mrs. Bain," she said, without asking our names in turn. "Sit down." It was more an order than an invitation. Besides the armchair in which Mrs. Bain sat, there were 4 walnut chairs set in a circle around a faded rug. Clara and I sat ourselves in 2 of these while Esther placed the dish of chocolates we had brought on the table before disappearing down the hall. The room gave me a queer feeling. There was a cast-iron fireplace decorated with lion's head mouldings, and the chairs we sat in had carved heads of nymphs on the crests and arms. The wallpaper was patterned in a peacock feather design, which gave the effect of dozens of eyes staring down at us. The woman in the room was blind, and yet I felt that we were being watched from every angle. Esther returned with a tray of cups and a teapot. I turned to Mrs. Bain. "I have to thank you," I said. "Your help has been invaluable to Clara's progress." I restrained myself from asking questions, but I was curious to know who Esther's mother was. There was a burled walnut piano in the corner of the room, its lid closed and covered in a white cloth. The piano appeared to be in good condition, but from the porcelain figurines that had been arranged on the lid, seemed to have not been played for some time. There were no photographs in the room or other personal mementos to give us a clue to the identity of Mrs. Bain and what made her an authority on music. The only thing I was sure of was that Esther and her mother had not always resided in Watson's Bay. The elaborate furniture was out of place in the wooden home, and out of keeping with the area, which was mostly fishermen's cottages and labourers' huts. Mrs. Bain returned my gratitude with a tight-lipped smile. Esther placed some chocolates on a plate on her mother's lap. Mrs. Bain picked one up and smelled it, but not in the timid, mouse-like way her daughter explored things. She gave the impression of a wolf sniffing the air before commencing the hunt. She put the chocolate back on her plate without touching it. Who could refuse one of Ranjana's delicious chocolates? I felt sorry for anyone who had lost a sense so precious as sight, but Mrs. Bain's behavior made me wonder if she had been an insensitive person all her life. "Your sister has natural aptitude," Mrs. Bain said to me, "but genius is a jealous god and demands sacrifice." The conversation continued in an awkward manner. I managed to elicit from Mrs. Bain that she had studied music in London and Vienna, and although she had never performed in anything more public than a soirée herself, she had taught piano, and many of her students had gone overseas to forge careers. I wanted to ask her what to do about Clara's musical education and whether she thought the Conservatorium High School would be a suitable institution. I had assumed Esther's mother might be interested to know that we were from Prague, the city that had produced great composers and inspired foreign ones. But Mrs. Bain talked about herself, about how her life had been ruined by the loss of her sight, how her status in society had been reduced by her husband's death and his family scrambling for the assets. She did not say outright that Esther had blighted her life, but she left us with the impression that she had been enjoying a long youth until her daughter came along. From the awkwardness with which Esther went about serving the tea, pushing the plates around the table, and nearly spilling the sugar, I sensed that we were the first visitors to the house in years, and a fresh audience for what Esther must have listened to every day. While Mrs. Bain might not be as rich now as when she lived with her husband in Point Piper, she was not exactly in the poorhouse. Her home could have been a lovely place to live, despite her blindness. But Mrs. Bain was determined to live miserably, and to make Esther do so along with her. The visit passed slowly, and we were relieved when it came time to leave. "Poor Esther," Clara said when we returned home. "What a joyless person she lives with." I am benefiting from Mrs. Bain's notes, but I see now that she is not sending them out of generosity. She just wants to show off. After listening to our story, Uncle Otto agreed. "It's Esther who enjoys Clara's playing, I think. The poor thing is starved for beauty and company. We need to entice her here more often." Clara continued to open the window when she practiced, and Mrs. Bain continued to send notes. But we were in no hurry for a return visit to our landlady's house, although I could not help thinking about Esther. I sensed she had potential for a bigger and better life. But was it her mother alone who had made her so frightened and drab? It was the milkman, our educator on everything we needed to know about Australia, from its politics to redback spiders, who gave us the answer. "Esther's a nice girl," he told us. "She fell in love with a Protestant, and her mother wouldn't let them marry. He died in the war. When Esther received the news, Mrs. Bain said it was just as well, and Esther could forget all about the boy now. Poor love. I don't think she ever got over that. She closed down and shut out the world." I felt for Esther. The sight of ex-soldiers wandering the streets, many missing a limb or an eye, still wearing their service badges on their shabby suits, was heartbreaking. The war had finished only a few years ago, and yet they had already become invisible. The world had moved on. But they must have been painful reminders to Esther of her lost love. Perhaps that was the reason she rarely went out. There was still no word from Aunt Josephine. "If something bad has happened, Dr. Holub would have told us," Uncle Otto assured me. "As they used to say in the war, no news is good news." Uncle Otto, however, received some information from the director of the Australian Museum about his job. And it was good news indeed. He beamed when he told us, "I've been promoted to a guide." I was glad for Uncle Otto, and sorry for him too. He was overqualified for the job. He had a university diploma and had mastered several languages during his travels. He wanted to be a teacher, but had been unable to obtain a university post because he was foreign. Still, the promotion meant that he would not be performing menial cleaning jobs any longer. Uncle Otto proved to be a popular tour guide and enjoyed his work so much that Ranjana suggested we invite people to our house each Tuesday evening for a lecture come soirée. For a small fee, we can treat guests to a recital by Clara, canapés courtesy of me, and a lecture by Otto based on his experiences traveling the world, she said. Other intellectuals would have come to Australia and balked at its working-class ethic and the lack of cultural institutions. Clara and I had been disappointed by the dearth of art exhibitions, theatre plays, and philosophical lectures in Sydney compared with Prague. But Ranjana and Uncle Otto saw what was required and created it for themselves. While Clara and I set out the chairs for the inaugural meeting, I wondered who would show up. At exactly 7 o'clock, I heard the gate open and footsteps come down the garden path. Within minutes, our back room was filled with an eclectic mix of people. A university professor and his wife, an artist, 3 shopkeepers, a grazier who was in town for the week, and an SP bookie who had seen Uncle Otter's advertisement in the window of the local grocery shop asking for interested people to travel the world and expand their minds for one evening a week. That first night, Uncle Otter gave a talk on African tribal masks and their spiritual meanings. The talk was well received, and word spread so quickly about the Tuesday lectures that for future meetings we had to take advance bookings due to the lack of space. When Uncle Otter needed a break, he invited a guest to speak about their area of expertise. Ranjana gave a lecture on vegetarianism, along with a cooking demonstration, while Clara talked about Chopin's hand technique. Uncle Otter made me give a lecture on pictorialism versus modernism in photography, which went well but caused me so much gut-twitching agitation that I refused to do one ever again. We invited Esther to the meetings. At first she declined, but one evening she arrived in a neatly ironed dress with a butterfly brooch on her shoulder. Although she shied away if anyone tried to speak to her, the physical transformation was dramatic, aside from the leaves in her hair, which Clara subtly picked out when she was not looking. The next Tuesday, while Ranjana and I were in the kitchen preparing the supper, we saw the kitchen window of Esther's house open. A few seconds later, Esther clambered out. That explained the leaves. She had to make her way through the overgrown back garden instead of taking the front path. "She's sneaking out of the house like a naughty adolescent," Ranjana said. "Wonderful," said Uncle Otter when we told him. "A few hours away from the dragon will do her good." We never mentioned to Esther that we knew her secret, for fear it would embarrass her and stop her from coming. But Uncle Otter was sure to hang some lamps in our garden and prop a ladder against the fence so Esther could find her way home without tearing her clothes.